Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming. My channel ISN and Oppos. T monetized, so if you and Oppos able to, please support me on PayPal to help me stay active. Continuing the story aboard the Kuan ship, Chan Ping and Oppos, and diligently practices martial arts until the carefree swordsman A and Oppos. Liang unexpectedly crashes from the heavens. Unfazed by his defeat, A and Oppos, Liang encourages Chan before rocketing back into the sky, inspiring the young boy to finish 1 million punches before learning swordplay. Later, Taoist nun He Xiaoyang settles Lu Chan and Oppos' karmic debts with Chan. To resolve her own great Tao trial, she bizarrely declares that Chan will be her husband, but only on the day he dies, leaving him completely bewildered. After disembarking, Chan befriends the impoverished Taoist Zhongshan Feng. While taking shelter in an eerie estate alongside heroic swordsman Xianxia, they are ambushed by a malicious tree demon. Chan showcases his formidable new martial prowess and uses his flying swords to repel the threat, uncovering a tragic romance between a fallen Taoist and his tree spirit wife. Deeply moved by their story, Chan secretly stamps a local map with Qi Jingchan and Oppos' divine mountain and water seals, instantly cleansing the region and Oppos' sinister energy and eradicating a corrupt local god. However, his peaceful journey is abruptly shattered when Chan unexpectedly reunites with his old nemesis, Ma Kuxuan, setting the stage for a brutal, long-awaited rematch. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Thankfully, everyone was distracted by the battle between Sun-Scorched Mountain and the Wind Lightning Field. It seemed that an epic battle between two formidable sects was more alluring to bystanders than a complex love story. Chan Ping and Oppos, and watched as He Xiaoyang ate an entire fire pair, but she still wasn't and Oppos, displaying any intention of talking, so he could only ask in a quiet voice, "May I ask what business you have with me, esteemed immortal he?" He Xiaoyang finally collected her thoughts upon hearing this, but she still didn't and Oppos say anything. Instead, she began to look closely at Chan Ping and Oppos, and, compared with back when she first met him on Azure Cow Ridge in Jewel's Small World, he had grown a little taller, his skin was slightly fairer, and there was a bit more of a spark in his eyes. As one of the branch masters of Taoism, Lu Chan had had a very candid conversation with He Xiaoyang prior to her departure. Aside from what He Xiaoyang had revealed to Chan Ping and Oppos, and there were many more secrets that she had to refrain from divulging for one reason or another. For example, at the time, Lu Chan had been situated in the house that neighbored Chan Ping and Oppos, and Oppos' enclave Vase Alley, seated on a small stool in front of the stove while holding a blowtube in his hand. He was the guest, yet he was forced to cook. Meanwhile, Zhigui was lazily sunbathing in the courtyard while occasionally turning to the kitchen and urging Lu Chan to speed up in his cooking. At the time, He Xiaoyang had been seated near Lu Chan, yet even after learning his true identity, she remained completely calm and collected, surprising even herself with her own composure. Despite the smug look on Lu Chan and Oppos' face at the time, he was complaining in a disgruntled voice, "Qi Jingchan insisted on playing matchmaker and leaving me with a massive predicament. Now it and Oppos' time for me to return the favor, and it and Oppos' my turn to play matchmaker. Let and Oppos' see who and Oppos' going to come out on top." There had been a sly grin on his face as he was speaking, but He Xiaoling remained completely unmoved, both internally and externally, much to Lu Chan and Oppos' dismay. Her personality was too much like his first senior brother. It would and Oppos' been far more interesting if she had been more like his second senior brother, but at the same time that would and Oppos' made her quite a pain to deal with. Another example was the young boy that had come out of Apricot Blossom Alley, Ma Kuxuan. While Lu Chan was waiting for his plan to come into fruition, he had told He Xiaoyang in a straightforward manner that the snake gall pebbles that Chan Ping and Oppos' had given to the two of them were like the banks of a river, while those pages that contained the medicinal recipe was like a bridge, particularly the stamp that bore the word signed Lu Chan. This was a long-term plot devised by Lu Chan, but there weren't and Oppos' really any sinister intentions behind it. On the contrary, Lu Chan had lent Chan Ping and Oppos' a helping hand after he had left the town. In the past, due to the fact that his bonded porcelain had been broken, he had missed opportunity after another, and he had only managed to survive thanks to his innate resilience and his special status as an important pawn. After weathering the storm that was the early stage of his life, he had begun to receive some reciprocation from the heavenly Tao, and that was one of the contributing factors behind the turn in his fortune. The other major factor behind this was none other than Lu Chun. Perhaps Qi Jingchun had already identified this, but he was still willing to go with the flow. He was confident that Chun Ping and Appo's fortune would turn eventually, and he could see that Chun Ping'an was a child who knew when to make the right sacrifices. Hence, he was happy to see Chun Ping and Appo's develop and grow. As for Chun Ping and Appo's himself, he was naturally completely oblivious to all of this. After the bridge was constructed, an extremely subtle yet profound connection had appeared between Chun Ping and Appo's and He Xiaoyang, and their fortunes and misfortunes had become shared and connected. Hence, it wasn't Appo's inaccurate to say that half of He Xiaoyang and Appo's fortune had been split to Chun Ping and Appo's, and the average person would and Appo's likely already perished had such an immense blessing of fortune been bestowed upon them. If the path that they walked had been as thin as paper, even a single drop of rain would and Appo's been enough to pierce through it, let alone a torrential downpour. Even if one had the blessing of walking on a far more sound and robust path, like the bluestone slab streets of Fortune Street, if they were excessively greedy and tried to take every piece of fortune that came their way, then their downfall would and Appo's also been inevitable. If one were to indulge in greed without discretion, then such an immense amount of fortune would and Appo's been enough to lead them to complete and utter destruction. Lu Chun harbored no ill will toward Chun Ping and Appo's, but at the same time he was also completely uncaring about whether Chun Ping and Appo's would be crushed under this enormous endowment of fortune. As it turned out, Qi Jingchun had chosen the wrong person. In the instant that she heard these secrets being revealed by a branch master, He Xiaoyang and Appo's perpetually calm and tranquil mental state finally began to waver, much like cracks appearing on a mirror. She had been blessed with tremendous fortune her entire life, yet at this moment, she was perched perilously on the edge of a cliff, and her next step was going to decide whether she would be able to continue to ascend against the flow of resistance to attain her great Tao, or if she was going to fall down the cliff and be crushed against the rocks below. Furthermore, even if she were to make the right choice, her rate of progress in cultivation still wouldn't Appo's be as rapid and uninhibited as it used to be. Up to that point, everything had gone her way, and this was the most perilous moment in her life. In particular, that feeling of being reduced to a pawn with her fate completely out of her hands was absolutely terrible. She wasn't Appo's cultivating to become a puppet controlled by some almighty figure, even if that controlling figure were Lu Chun, the branch master of the heavenly world. Compared with the previous instance, this made He Xiaoyang feel even more lost and agitated. From the moment that she successfully severed her period back when she was 14 years old, He Xiaoyang noticed that the look in her master and Appo's eyes when he gazed upon her changed. As time passed, she began to realize that the look in his eyes that always made her feel slightly uncomfortable was no longer just the benevolence that a senior displayed to their junior. Instead, it was also interspersed with the lust that men felt toward women. At the time, Qizhan was in the midst of a period of seclusion, and everyone in the entire Divine Edict sect had been very anxious. Prior to her departure to Jewel Small World, her master had revealed his intentions to her in a candid fashion, telling her that he wanted her to become his Tao partner. He had also declared that he was willing to leave Divine Edict sect for her, that they could become a pair of free and unrestrained lovebirds that roamed the wilderness, not having to care about social norms and the opinions of others. If He Xiaoyang didn't and Appo's want to live such a lifestyle, then he was also open to becoming Tao partners in secret, while continuing to present themselves as master and disciple on the surface. He had promised her that the incomplete scroll that contained the dual cultivation technique in his possession would allow them both to reach the upper 5 tiers without having to resort to unsightly bedroom activities. He Xiaoyang was unwilling to comply, and she knew that if it weren't and Appo's for the fact that her master wasn't Appo's confident in his ability to discreetly force her into submission, then he would and Appo's most definitely already taken her by force. That was why she had embarked on that long journey to Jewel Small World. There were some pieces of scenery that Xiaoyang wanted to see by climbing to the top of the mountain through her own power alone. In reality, she didn't and oppose really care about the negative connotations surrounding dual cultivation techniques, or so-called blasphemous relationships between masters and disciples. The only thing that she had eyes for was the Great Tao, the truly top-tier dual cultivation secret techniques of Taoism wherein and oppose actually anywhere near as unsightly and lascivious as mortals perceive them to be. Dual cultivation was considered to be a shady and crooked path to pursue, which was a derogatory categorization, but to Qi refiners, these supposedly shady and crooked paths were simply ones that couldn't and oppose take one directly to the upper 5 tiers. Even so, they could still have been pursued to great effect. Following her return from the Great Li Empire, her master had completely done away with his disguise as a benevolent senior. He started using all types of tactics to try and get her to submit to him, including coercion, threats, and scare tactics. Xiaoyang dealt with everything as they came, calmly nullifying all of her master and oppo's attempts to force her to bend to his will, but deep down, she felt a little pity for him because she knew that the great Tao that he had chosen was far too narrow and crooked. She wasn't and oppose willing to accompany him down this narrow path, which would and oppose only led to a piece of scenery nowhere near spectacular enough to satisfy her. After that, Sword Immortal Wei Jin of the Wind Snow Temple had arrived in Southern Stream Nation. Xiaoyang and Appo's master had mistaken him for an ally that she had called upon, and as a result he became far more restrained. However, to his surprise and elation, Xiaoyang turned down Wei Jin as well, and he had departed in a heartbroken and drunken daze on the back of his donkey. He felt as if he had been given another chance, yet little did he know that there were only going to be more obstacles standing in his way. The young Taoist priest who was of the same level of seniority as him dared to protect Xiaoyang, despite the fact that he didn't possess a particularly lofty cultivation base. He had directly confronted Xiaoyang's master and made a serious threat that placed the latter in a very difficult position, one in which he was unsure of whether he should back down or continue to force the issue. However, once again, the heavens seemed to have smiled down upon him, and the young Taoist priest set off for Middle-earth Divine Continent not long thereafter, doing so in such a hurry that he was only able to have one private conversation with Xiaoyang before he left. All of the outsiders invested in this matter had thought that she had left Divine Edict sect to pursue her junior uncle, but in reality, she had chosen to remove herself from Divine Edict sect entirely. This presented her master with what he perceived to be another opportunity, but sect master Qizhan had been very tolerant of her actions, deciding not to pursue Xiaoyang as a traitor of the sect despite the widespread objections. All of the elders of Divine Edict sect had been infuriated by her action, feeling as if their sect had raised a heartless traitor, but they couldn't oppose the orders of their sect master, so they could only give up. Only Xiaoyang's master insisted on pursuing her for an interrogation, but he was also dissuaded from doing so. At the time, Xiaoyang had already traveled with Lu Chun to the Great Li Empire, and she had heard that her master had been dissuaded from coming after her, but she knew that Qizhan had stopped her master by force. Perhaps they had even engaged in battle before her master was forced back to his residence. His great Tao was already standing on its last legs, and without her, it would completely collapse. Given his stubborn personality, there was no way that he would give up without a fight, but ultimately, everything that he did would prove to be futile as Lu Chun was the one standing behind her, a man who could order even Qizhan around like a servant. Countless thoughts were running through Xiaoyang and Appo's mind, and she remained silent, refraining from answering Chanping and Appo's question, so he could only wait in silence himself. All of a sudden, Xiaoyang and Appo's eyes lit up and she abruptly rose to her feet, looking as if a knot in her heart had just been unraveled. No matter how cunning and scheming Lu Chun is, he and Appo's still only going with the flow. In the end, we were fated to be a match made in heaven. However, the light in her eyes then abruptly faded. She could still recall that the first time she had seen Chanping and Appo's, and she had identified that the two were connected by fate, but only very loosely so. That was the true intention of her great Tao. So why was it that she was now concerning herself with fate, and even thinking to herself that they were a match made in heaven? This was still all a part of Lu Chun and Appo's plans. Sure enough, A lazy and slightly amused voice rang out in her heart to confirm her suspicions. You and Appos re-correct. The fact that you were able to reach this conclusion by yourself tells me that you and Appos V arrived at the right answer through this period of self-reflection. With that, the cracks in your mental state have already been completely mended. Even if you and Appos re-dealt another heavy blow in the future, your mental state one and Appos T be brought to the verge of completely crumbling as it did this time. Now that you and Appos V overcome this hurdle, you can go to travel complete read continent. Let me make this clear in advance. I Haven and Appos T been eavesdropping on this conversation. Instead, I and Appos V planted something in your heart well before this, and I and Appos LL immediately be informed once you arrive at the right answer. Setting that aside for now, I have one final question for you. What are you going to do with Chun Ping and Appos, N? Actually, that and Appos S a little bit ambiguous, and it and Appos S not true to my usual style. The question should be, hold a hand to your voluptuous chest and ask your conscience whether you should get rid of this young boy. You and Appos Re clearly connected to by fate, but you and Appos Re unsure of whether the connection will have a positive or negative impact on you. Are you going to kill him right here and now to prevent the potential formation of future knots in your heart that could destabilize the foundation of your great Tao? Xiaoyang cast her gaze toward Chun Ping and Appos, and with her cheeks flushed and a cold look in her eyes, Chun Ping and Appos and looked back at her, feeling as if his entire body had been plunged into a glacial pit. Inside his sword-nurturing gourd, 1st and 15th were both ready to spring forth at a moment and Appos S notice. It seemed that no matter what she did, it would still all be a part of Lu Chun and Appos S plans. The first time, Xiaoyang had to get over the hurdle that was herself, and this time she had to get over the hurdle that had been personally set up for her by the branch master himself. Of course, Lu Chun hadn't and Appos T gone all out as doing that would and Appos V been no different to forcing her to her death. Clearly, he had high hopes for Xiaoyang and wanted to test her, but not to the point that she would be doomed to fail. For the second time, Xiaoyang was having to go through a process of rigorous self-reflection. The cold look in her eyes gradually became one of seduction, and coupled with her flushed cheeks, this was a very foreign and unusual appearance for her. At the same time, her mental state was fluctuating wildly like waves crashing against the shore, and it was a very painful state of uncertainty. Chun Ping and Appos and remained silent as he stared intently at Xiaoyang, who was behaving very strangely in his eyes. In fact, he was even beginning to wonder whether this was a fox demon that had taken on Xiaoyang and Appos S appearance in an attempt to seduce him. Otherwise, why was she acting so out of character? Furthermore, his instincts told him that he was currently walking on a perilous tightrope between life and death. Xiaoyang was unconsciously gripping the edge of the table tightly with both hands, and a sheen of sweat had appeared on her forehead. Right at this moment, a faint sigh rang out in her heart, forcibly quelling her mental turmoil. Xiaoyang, I and Appos V already given you the answer, it and Appos S just that you and Appos V been blinded by your pursuit of the great Tao and refused to see it. You can kill him if you want, and I won and Appos T stop you. You can also choose to spare him, and I won and Appos T force you to do the opposite. Either way, you and Appos LL be able to pass this test, yet you insist on driving yourself into a corner where neither decision seems feasible. You and Appos Re even considering the worst possible option, which is to kill Chun Ping and Appos and then marry him posthumously. In doing so, you and Appos LL be able to sever the karma between the two of you while also maintaining a clear conscience, but this is downright preposterous. Will doing something so foolish and contrived really allow you to reach the heights that you desire? Have you considered why it is that Chun Ping and Appos and has been dealt a terrible hand at every turn, yet has been able to live to this point, while you possess exceptional aptitude and are blessed with immense fortune, yet can and Appos to even step over the easiest hurdle to bypass that stands in your way? All of a sudden, Xiaoyang collapsed back into her chair in a defeated manner with her head slumping down onto the table. Her face was extremely flushed, and she was panting heavily as she cast her gaze toward Chun Ping and Appos, and with a film of tears in her eyes. There was a mixture of guilt and indignation on her face, but all of her killing intent had faded away, and Chun Ping and Appos and had no idea what had led to this change. What in Oppos going on? I haven't in Oppos. T done anything. I haven't in Oppos. T even used the flying swords in my sword nurturing gourd yet. Besides, in the face of a chi refiner as formidable as Xiaoyang, even if he were to unleash both 1st and 15th, along with subduing demons and eliminating fiends, there was still no chance that he would and Oppos have been able to survive, let alone defeat her. Only after a little while did Xiaoyang return to her senses, and the tears in her eyes faded alongside the flush in her cheeks as she recovered her composure. She rose to her feet and smiled at Chanping and Oppos, and finally reverting back to the celestial maiden that Chanping and Oppos and had seen during their first encounter, and she declared in a decisive voice, Chanping and Oppos, and the day you die will be the day you become my husband. In the end, she had decided to abide by half of her original decision, choosing to deepen her fated ties with Chanping and Oppos, and rather than to kill him. Lu Chan and Oppos' voice rang out once again in Xiaoyang and Oppos' heart, and it was full of approval as he declared, Xiaoyang, from this moment forth, you are now my 6th direct disciple, and you are permitted to establish a sect of your own on the complete Reed continent. Meanwhile, Chanping and Oppos was completely flabbergasted, and he couldn't and Oppos help but ask, what did you say, esteemed immortal he? Did I mishear you? Could you repeat what you just said? What and Oppos? All this nonsense about me becoming her husband after I and Oppos am dead. Chanping and Oppos was becoming more and more convinced that this Xiaoyang was actually some troublemaking fox demon in disguise. Xiaoyang was a little frustrated and embarrassed, and she gave Chanping and Oppos a displeased glare, then took one final long look at him before departing. In the wake of her departure, Chanping and Oppos remained in his chair with his brows tightly furrowed. In the small town in the Dragon Spring Prefecture, a young Taoist priest wearing a lotus flower hat was seated by himself behind a small desk in an old school building that was no longer in use. He cast his gaze toward the spot where Qi Jingchun had been standing for 60 years, and he was silent as he unconsciously traced a finger back and forth over the surface of the desk. Upon returning to his senses, Lu Chan raised a hand, making a grabbing motion, and he was able to scoop Xiaoyang straight up from the Kuan ship and pull her to his side. Even for a golden core tier chi refiner like Xiaoyang, instantly traveling over such a vast distance left her reeling from a sense of dizziness, and she stumbled momentarily before steadying herself. A solemn look then appeared on her face, and she took a moment to compose herself and smooth down her clothes before taking 3 steps back and falling to her knees, then kowtowed to the ground as she declared, Disciple Xiaoyang pays her respects to her master. It was nothing short of an enormous blessing for the jade girl of a continent and Oppos' Taoist orthodoxy like her to become a direct disciple to a branch master of Taoism. Lu Chun nodded in response, then gestured for Xiaoyang to get up as he said, There and Oppos' no need to observe such trivial formalities as my disciple, it and Oppos' the thought that counts. You probably don't and Oppos' believe what I and Oppos' am saying right now, but you and Oppos' come to understand once you meet your 5 other senior brothers and sisters. Outside of the great Tao, everything else is completely superfluous. Lu Chan had been born in Majestic World, but he had actually grown up in Heavenly World, and he didn't and Oppos' place much bearing on the rites and formalities observed in Confucianism or even the integral rules of Taoism. Even prior to his ascension, he had always placed very little weight on social norms, and that was why he lived a very carefree and uninhibited life and why his writings were renowned for their free-flowing nature. In contrast with his first senior brother, who was meticulous to a fault, and his second senior brother, who was very careful and prudent, even in the face of their master, Lu Chun had never been one to follow rules. He had been scolded by his first senior brother and even beaten by his second senior brother for this, but he remained true to himself. Thankfully, his master wasn't an Oppos' bothered by his uncouth nature. Lu Chun could see that Xiaoyang was feeling rather tense and apprehensive, and he smiled as he asked, Why are you so nervous? Could it be that you and Oppos' still apprehensive about what happened before? Are you thinking that I and Oppos' am constantly trying to go around setting traps for you? Is that why you feel the need to meticulously ponder everything that I say and do? If that and Oppos' what you and Oppos' rethinking, then you and Oppos' wrong. Overcompensation is just as much of a mistake as lack of adaptation. You were able to become my direct disciple as you managed to pass 3 tests, the first of which is that you detected my machinations and immediately peered into your own heart, remaining true to yourself and dispelling the illusion that you and Chanping and Oppos, and were A and Oppos, match made in heaven and Oppos. That allowed you to grasp the truth, which is that the two of you are only loosely tied together by fate. Only after passing this test will you be able to ensure your own survival on complete Reed continent. That continent is filled with swordsmen, and everything is settled by the sharpness of one and Oppos' sword or the hardness of one and Oppos' fists. You and Oppos' eventually encounter some major setbacks there, and given how smoothly everything has gone in your life thus far, your mentality will completely crumble if your mental state is affected by these setbacks. If that happens, then I and Oppos' have no choice but to give up on you. Lu Chan smiled as he continued. On this occasion, Xianxia requested 3 people from the Great Li Empire. Setting aside Li Shixing for now, Ma Kuxuan was the lucky child chosen by my second senior brother. There may be quite a large age gap between the two, but their personalities are very much alike, and that and Oppos' why he was chosen. As for whether there were other hidden circumstances involved, the rules of the Taoist orthodoxy stipulate that junior and senior brothers are not to perform divination on one another, so I have no way of knowing. You are the one chosen by me as your Tao heart, and your cultivation experiences are very similar to my past experiences. You had to see through illusions to find yourself, and the situation ISN and Oppos' anywhere near as complex as you imagine it to be. I didn't and Oppos' choose you to serve as a pawn or puppet to play a role for Taoism in the battle between the 100 schools of thought or anything like that. Instead, I simply liked the look of you, so I decided to take you as my disciple. Do you really think those old farts in the Confucian temples would actually let me go free without closely scrutinizing my every move? My intentions and plans are a complete open book. As for whether you and Oppos' be able to establish a firm foothold on complete Reed continent and survive to the very end, that will be up to you. Once I travel to Heavenly World, I want and Oppos' go out of my way to look out for my disciples. The Confucian sages one and Oppos' intentionally try to harm you, and you have a senior brother who and Oppos' roaming Middle-earth divine continent, as well as a senior sister who and Oppos' cultivating at the Sword Chi Great Wall. If anything happens, you can turn to them for help. Now that you and Oppos' a disciple of mine, you have certain standards to live up to, and you have to do me proud, but Don and Oppos' worry I and Oppos' am not like your previous master back at Divine Edict sect, and I want and Oppos' force you to engage in dual cultivation with me. Xiaoyang had reverted back to the same beautiful Taoist nun as before, the one who regarded everything else outside of the great Tao as inconsequential, and she asked a question that had been on her mind for a long time. Are there also Confucian sages pulling strings in secret in Heavenly World that our Taoist teaching has full control over? Lu Chan immediately burst into laughter. Of course, it and Oppos' the same everywhere, and everyone is very busy. Surely you Don and Oppos' think that the likes of Ma Kuxuan, Wei Jin, and Song Chongjing are the cream of the crop among the prodigies of this world? If you do think that, then you should really go and visit Middle-earth Divine Continent, or White Jade capital of Heavenly World. In those places you and Oppos' come to realize that there and Oppos' always a more brilliant prodigy out there. Xiaoyang was seated behind a nearby desk, and she was looking directly into Lu Chan and Oppos' eyes. After hearing what he had said, her brows furrowed slightly, as if she was perplexed about something. You must be wondering why the 3 teachings Don and Oppos' just establish an agreement to only develop their forces on their own territory instead of going to the trouble of meddling with one another, right? Lu Chan asked with an amused expression. Xiaoyang nodded in response. That was exactly what she was thinking. That and Oppos' because all of the territories are ancient battlefields that were claimed by our predecessors at the cost of their lives, Lu Chan explained. We and Oppos' also afraid that the territories that we rule over could turn on us. If we choose to willingly isolate ourselves, or our actions make those beneath us feel as if their pursuit of the great Tao is being restricted, then the ultimate outcome can be seen in all of the current worlds. Lu Chan casually pointed in the direction of the immortal tomb in the town as he continued. The worlds continue to exist, But the once high and mighty rulers of these worlds have been reduced to nothing more than sets of remains buried in the ground. A hint of enlightenment appeared in Xiaoyang and Appo's eyes. Some things were too distant and too difficult to understand, and those who knew about such things were unwilling to divulge these matters to others or write them down in recordings, so their successors naturally remained oblivious. There were far too many theories out there, and the flames of speculation were only further fanned by the fictionists, overtly imaginative and expressive scholars, and historians who wanted to make it appear as if they knew more than the average person. With so much false information constantly circulating, even if some grains of truth did rise to the surface, they would be quickly drowned out again, and ultimately reality would be twisted to the point that untruths were lauded, while the truth was condemned as fiction. Lu Chun smiled as he continued, but I digress. Let and Oppos. Get back to the main topic. Your second test is one in which I have to determine whether you and Oppos will be dependent on Heavenly Lord Xianxia during your trip to complete Reed Continent, or whether you and Oppos will be establishing your own sect there. That and Oppos. Why I intentionally set a trap for you, leading you to the false belief that you turned your back on both of the correct options while choosing the most incorrect one that and Oppos will make you miss out on any opportunity to fulfill your great Tao. As a result, you and Oppos will be filled with remorse and begin to doubt your own judgment and Tao heart. I was only able to pass the test thanks to the shred of clarity I had remaining in my mind, Xiaoyang replied in a candid fashion. Lu Chun smiled as he said, with regard to this point, I used it as the finale to explain why you and Changping and Oppos were connected by fate. Let and Oppos talk about the final test first. This one is a bit more complicated as it has multiple parts. The term and Oppos, love and Oppos, can encompass many different meanings, and romantic love can easily arise between a man and a woman. Hence, I planted a seed of love in your heart without your detection, and whenever the seed is nourished by the waters of fate, it and Oppos will sprout and grow at a rapid rate. This method of speeding things along normally does more harm than good, but it and Oppos actually perfect in your case. Besides, even the unadvised methods can turn into effective ones when used by me. When it came to your former master from Divine Edict sect, who raised and nurtured you from a young age, and the exceptional prodigy Wei Jin, you were able to pass both of those tests with ease, remaining true to yourself and not wavering in the slightest. But when it came to the final test in the form of Changping and Oppos, I decided to intentionally make things more difficult for you. I actively established a bridge between the two of you to place you in a difficult dilemma. If you had abandoned your free will and chosen to follow the path that I set out for you just because you were intimidated by my status as a branch master, then I would and Oppos still allowed you to establish a sect of your own on complete Reed Continent, but I definitely would and Oppos have accepted you as my disciple. Finding a suitable disciple is a very difficult matter. Lu Chun and Oppos' smile faded as he continued, if you want to become my disciple, then you should harbor the ambition to go even further and reach even loftier heights than I have. In my eyes there and Oppos' no such thing as turning your back on conventional wisdom and straying off the right path. Conventional wisdom is just a set of rules written down by those who and Oppos come before us, and the so-called right path is just the beaten path walked by our predecessors. As for whether those things are actually correct, why Don and Oppos, you go and take a look for yourself? Even someone as aloof and detached as Xiaoyang Kuden and Oppos helped but be struck by a sense of awe and veneration upon hearing this. She rose to her feet, then extended a respectful curtsy to Lu Chun as she said, I hope that someday I can reach the lofty heights upon which you stand and sit alongside you as equals. That and Oppos' going to be rather difficult, Lu Chun mused. Xiaoyang sat back down as she asked, Master, what did you mean when you referred to the and Oppos finale and Oppos earlier? And is there some deeper meaning behind my fated ties with Changping and Oppos? Lu Chun nodded in response. Of course. If you were an and Oppos, Xiaoyang and he was an and Oppos, Changping and Oppos, and you were just a pair of ordinary people instead, it would and Oppos indeed been rather foolish of me to play matchmaker between the two of you. Qi Jingchun was playing matchmaker in order to place a burden on Changping and Oppos, and Oppos' shoulders in the hope that his heart will be honed to the point that it and Oppos will be able to carry the weight of mountains someday. As for you and Chunping and Appos, and you two are like a pair of mirrors that reflect one another, and it wasn't Appos. Just a matter of having Chunping and Appos, and share your fortune and using him as a test to help you overcome the hurdle of love. When it comes to Chunping and Appos, and Appos' personality, I and Appos, we've seen countless strange and enigmatic people in this world, and he and Appos' not all that strange or remarkable, but his personality is very similar yet also different from yours. There and Appos' a certain level of affinity between the two of you, and that and Appos' why even during your first encounter, you were able to tell that the two of you were loosely connected by fate. In reality, your fated ties aren't and Appos' that loose it and Appos' just that your cultivation base is limited, and you couldn't and Appos' see the true depth of those ties. Is this another test, master? Xiaoyang asked in a quiet voice. Lu Chun burst into laughter. Why would I test you when you and Appos' already become my disciple? Are you not going to be satisfied unless you become a direct disciple to the Tao ancestor himself so you can rank alongside me as equals? Xiaoyang and Appos' eyes remained clear and lucid as she shook her head with a smile and replied, that is not my intention. Seeing as I and Appos' become your master, I should give you a welcoming gift as my new disciple. This is not an insignificant gift, it and Appos' a bit of and Appos', Tao and Appos', that I managed to obtain from your grandmaster prior to coming here, Lu Chan said with a smile. Xiaoyang faltered slightly upon hearing this. She had only just severed the bridge between herself and Chunping and Appos', and back on the Kuan ship, and it appeared that she had already reverted back into the Xiaoyang that was blessed by the heavens. Lu Chan seemed to have gleaned her thoughts, and he burst into laughter as he declared, let me take on a trip against the flow of time. Even though all mystical abilities were restricted in Jewel's small world, it was still unable to escape from the overarching laws of the world, such as the precession of seasons and the cycle of birth, growth, illness, and death. With Lu Chen and Appos' powers, he was able to display these cycles to Xiaoyang. Xiaoyang was still situated in the school, yet it seemed as if she were temporarily disconnected from this world, and her eyes were glowing as she looked at all of the scenes acting out in reverse around her. This was the exact path that she wanted to pursue. Lu Chan smiled as he said, follow me and I and Appos' I'll take you somewhere to meet two people. The two of them set off with the sound of children reading aloud ringing out clearer and clearer behind them in the school, except their reciting was also in reverse, and it was truly as if they had memorized the book so well that they could recite them back to front. The children and Appos' appearances and voices were clearly visible and audible, but perhaps due to certain restrictions or the deal that Qi Jingchun had made with the Tao ancestor, he was nowhere to be seen in the classroom. It was as if he had never existed, and his presence had completely faded from the river of time. Lu Chan passed through a series of streets and alleys with Xiaoyang right on his heels, sticking close behind him for fear of getting lost, and being unable to find her way out again. In the end, Lu Chan stopped in his tracks and told Xiaoyang to wait, and she immediately obliged, not daring to make a single move. With a sweep of his sleeve, the flow of time was reversed back to the correct direction, and all order was restored. After that, Lu Chan led her to a nearby stand. Xiaoyang didn't and Appos' know why he had brought her here, and she couldn't and Appos' help but wonder if there was something special about this street-side stand. The stall owner was a humble and honest-looking middle-aged man who was selling tonghulu. A short while later, Xiaoyang spotted a thin and dark-skinned child slowly approaching the stand. He stopped right beside her, taking a glance at the bustling tonghulu stand as he gulped down some drool. After business had died down a little, the child departed. Lu Chan snapped his fingers, and a day immediately passed by. The tonghulu stand continued to operate day after day, and the child passed by it over and over again while returning from collecting medicinal herbs in the mountains, or from catching fish in the creek, or while helping his neighbors carry water to their residences. One day, the child set off to pick medicinal herbs from the mountain as usual, carrying his basket on his back, but upon reaching the entrance of Clay Vase Alley, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. During his last outing, he was very fortunate to have picked up a few very valuable medicinal herbs, and in a rare display of prosperity, the small rice jar back home had been filled past the halfway mark, so he wasn't and Appos' T going to have to worry about food for at least the next 10 days. With that in mind, he looked up at the gloomy sky, seemingly telling himself that a heavy storm was coming, so even if he did set off for the mountains, he would most likely have to turn back around anyway. Hence, the child rushed back to his house, then removed the basket from his back before digging a small clay jar out from the foot of his yard wall. He tipped several copper coins out of the small jar, then quickly rushed out of Cultivation Alley to the Tonghulu stand. However, the closer he drew to the stand, the heavier his footsteps became, and he slowed down further and further. Finally, he stopped in his tracks while still quite far away from the stall with a conflicted look on his face, and his fist clenched harder around the copper coins. In the end, the child took a few more steps forward, then squatted down and began staring at the bright red Tonghulus with a dazed expression. Lu Chun and He Xiaoyang were standing right beside him, and the former smiled as he asked, if you were in his shoes, what do you think he would be thinking at this moment? If only I could eat the Tonghulu and not have to pay. He Xiaoyang immediately replied without any hesitation. Lu Chun nodded in response. Keep watching. During a lull in business, the Tonghulu stand owner seemed to have spotted the boy who was always passing by his stand, but could never afford to buy a Tonghulu. Initially, the stand owner sat on his chair in silence, but in the end, it seemed that he felt sympathetic toward the child, and he stood up as he beckoned to the boy with a smile. I and Oppos am about to pack up for the day, and I and Oppos am not going to be able to sell these remaining Tonghulus. If you want one, I can give one to you for free. The stand owner wore a friendly smile as he spoke, and he pulled out a Tonghulu before offering it to the boy. Go on, take it. However, the child hurriedly rose to his feet, then shook his head with a smile before running away. He Xiaoyang was a little perplexed to see this. If this was a younger version of Chun Ping and Oppos, and then she actually wooed and Oppos, T have found this decision to be strange at all. Lu Chun pointed at the Tonghulu stand owner as he said, this man is a naturalist from Middle-earth Divine Continent who ISN and Oppos, T all that renowned among mortals, but in reality, he alone possesses the power to contend against the entirety of the naturalist Lu clan. He and Oppos is a very strange and remarkable person, and even my first senior brother doesn't and Oppos T have a grasp on his thoughts and intentions. He Xiaoyang became even more perplexed upon hearing this. Let me show you why I brought you here, Lu Chun said with a smile, then extended a hand forward and swept it through the air to conjure up a Chun Ping and Oppos. And the child rushed over and accepted the free Tonghulu, then skipped joyfully back to Cultivation Alley. After having the Tonghulu, he was unable to forget the taste, and a few days later, he returned to the stand to receive another free Tonghulu. As time passed, a hint of laziness began to arise in his heart. He would often think of the Tonghulu stand, and he would pick fewer medicinal herbs during his forays into the mountains than he normally would. This mindset was only compounded day after day, year after year, and while it wasn't and Oppos T necessarily the case that he had become a bad person, he was no longer the same Chun Ping and Oppos, and that He Xiaoyang had first encountered on the Azure Cow Ridge. After that, they returned to that point in time, and Lu Chun conjured up another Chun Ping and Oppos, and with a sweep of his hand, this time he didn't and Oppos T choose to accept the free Tonghulu. Instead, he paid for it, and after that he became even more motivated to work, becoming obsessed with earning money. Eventually, he grew tired of Tonghulus, but then developed a taste for pastries. Just like the previous scenario, the child continued to grow up year after year, and this Chun Ping and Oppos, and also Wasn and Oppos T quite right in He Xiaoyang and Oppos' eyes. As Lu Chun raised his hand over and over again, He Xiaoyang saw one Chun Ping and Oppos, and after another, all of whom made slightly different decisions, leading to a variety of different changes. In the end, He Xiaoyang fell into deep thought. Lu Chun smiled as he said, let and Oppos go back. With that, the two of them returned to the school. This trip through the river of time was very much like that time when Qi Jingchun had led Chun Ping and Oppos, and to the old locust tree to secure a locust leaf. Lu Chun and Oppos' hands were clasped behind his back as he led the way forward and asked, have you figured out what I and Oppos am trying to show you? Only by remaining true to oneself can one remain oneself. He Xiaoyang replied in a quiet voice. Lu Chun nodded in response but offered no reply. Could it be that I and Oppos am wrong and I and Oppos, am too short-sighted? He Xiaoyang asked. Lu Chen turned around with a smile as he replied, no, not at all. You arrived at the correct conclusion. The only problem is that you seem to be oblivious to just how mighty your master and Oppos' powers are. While Lu Chen was passing through a certain passage of time with He Xiaoyang, there was a Confucian scholar with a pair of gray sideburns sitting in a room on his own. Having just dismissed the schoolchildren for the day, the scholar was playing out a go position on his own according to a manual. His face was no longer blurry and indistinct, having become clearly visible, and right as Lu Chen and He Xiaoyang were passing by outside, Qi Jingchun bent down to pick up a go stone as he smiled and mused to himself, it and Oppos' nothing much by the time Chen Ping and Oppos' and made his way down the staircase and returned to his seat. He had already missed 2 major battles. Taoist priest Zhang Shan, who was seated on the adjacent chair, hurriedly rose to his feet and cupped his fist in a grateful salute upon spotting Chen Ping and Oppos', and who returned the salute before accepting the jade badge that was being returned to him. For this publicly disclosed battle between sworn enemies, the battlefield hadn't and Oppos' been set in either Wind Lightning Field or on Sun Scorch Mountain in order to ensure fairness. Instead, the designated battlefield was the divine platform of Wind Snow Temple. As a military and sacred land, Wind Snow Temple was on friendly terms with more powers than true Martial Mountain, and it had also always kept a lower profile. The disciples who left the sect to go on long journeys mostly did so for exploration and training purposes rather than to step onto any battlefields, so Wind Snow Temple had good relations with both sects and Wazn and Oppos' going to be biased toward either one. As for why Wind Snow Temple had chosen the divine platform, one of the reasons was because it was situated on the summit of a tall mountain, thereby providing a stunning view and wide horizons. Purely visually speaking, the divine platform was the most scenic location in the entirety of Wind Snow Temple. On top of that, the divine platform had very few disciples and was being propped up almost solely by Wei Jin, but due to reasons surrounding Wei Jin and Oppos' master, he didn't and Oppos' have very close ties with the sect, so it was presumably the case that Wind Snow Temple was trying to take advantage of this opportunity to add some numbers to the divine platform and Oppos' ranks. After hearing the outcomes of the first 2 battles from Qiu Shi, Chen Ping and Oppos' was astonished. Wind Lightning Field had lost both battles, losing a pair of renowned and formidable swordsmen in the process, both of whom had perished to their Sun Scorch Mountain opponents. For the second battle, both of the combatants had perished, but the cultivator of Sun Scorch Mountain had managed to survive just a little longer than his Wind Lightning Field opponent. So according to the rules, Wind Snow Temple assigned the victory to Sun Scorch Mountain. Despite how vast the divine platform was, there weren't and Oppos' many people who had come to spectate the battles. There was a small cluster of buildings situated in the divine platform and Oppos' northeastern corner, and only the Qi refiners of Eastern Treasured Vial Continent who possessed sufficient status and cultivation base were permitted to spectate the battles from those buildings. As for everyone else who wished to spectate, they could only do so from afar from the other mountains in Wind Snow Temple. Hence, the 2 opposing sects occupied virtually the entirety of the divine platform. Only after some conversation did Chen Ping and Oppos' discover that Zhang Shan hadn't and Oppos' even heard of Wind Lightning Field and Sun Scorch Mountain before. However, this wasn't an Oppos' all that unexpected. The Qi refiners of complete Reed Continent had always held themselves in very high regard, and as the smallest of the 9 continents, Eastern Treasured Vial Continent had perpetually been looked down on. Perhaps only the likes of Mountain Cliff Academy, Lakeview Academy, and people like Cui Chan Song Chongjing and Wei Jin were worthy of any degree of respect in the eyes of complete Reed Continent and Oppos' cultivators. Furthermore, given Zhang Shan and Oppos' cultivation base and the fact that he was from a different continent, it wouldn't Oppos' been much stranger if he had known so much about Eastern Treasured Vial Continent. The entire continent was aware that Wind Lightning Field and Sun Scorch Mountain were sworn enemies. In the sword spar arena in the deepest part of Wind Lightning Field were the remains of the Sun Scorch Mountain matriarch. Following her demise in battle, she had been exposed to the elements to this very day. And not only was Wind Lightning Field unwilling to return the body so that the disciples of Sun Scorch Mountain could hold a proper burial, even the long sword that impaled her head to put an end to her life hadn't and Oppos' been pulled out. Her body remained in the sword spar arena for all disciples and visitors of Wind Lightning Field to gawk and jeer at, and it had already been this way for 300 years. This was humiliation of the highest order. Sun-Scorched Mountain stood at the pinnacle of swordsmanship on the continent, and it had been going from strength to strength during the past 300 years. Its 3 youngest generations of disciple were already more exceptional than those of Wind Lightning Field, and roughly once every 60 years, someone from Sun-Scorched Mountain would issue a challenge to Wind Lightning Field in an attempt to recover the remains of their matriarch. However, the master of Wind Lightning Field, the very same person who had slain Sun-Scorched Mountain's matriarch, lived for 300 more years after that battle. Even though Sun-Scorched Mountain had churned out a whole host of prodigies during this time, none of them were able to defeat the field master. When it came to those who came to challenge him, he dealt with them more humanely than he did with Sun-Scorched Mountain's matriarch, but he certainly wasn't oppose, kind or benevolent by any stretch of the imagination, either snapping the bridge of immortality of the challenger, or destroying their bonded swords. In reality, for the cultivators of Sun-Scorched Mountain, this was a fate worse than death, and they wouldn't oppose. We much rather died a valiant death in battle than be relegated to such a terrible fate. This was the origin of the classic story of one man from Wind Lightning Field dominating an entire mountain. Finally, the master of Wind Lightning Field passed away, and it was said that he had gone into the cycle of reincarnation in early spring. His passing also coincided with the passage of 60 years since the last challenge, and even though Wind Lightning Field had done everything in its power to keep this a secret, the cultivators of Sun-Scorched Mountain were still somehow able to find out. In the wake of this news being leaked, the cultivators of Sun-Scorched Mountain were ecstatic, with some offering incense and wine to their deceased matriarch, while some of the elderly cultivators who had lived through the humiliation from 300 years ago drank until they were completely inebriated. The young swordsmen of Sun-Scorched Mountain were raring to go, having finally been presented with an opportunity to exact vengeance for the 300 years of humiliation that they had suffered. Sun-Scorched Mountain had won the first 2 battles in very convincing fashion, and as a result, the third battle that was supposed to have decided the outcome of the contest had become completely superfluous. Cho Shi was actually feeling a little concerned. In her eyes, the final battle most likely wasn't going to happen. Wind Lightning Field had already lost 2 battles, and they were able to save some face in the second battle, during which both combatants had fallen to their demise, but if they were to lose the final battle, then that would be 3 losses in a row, and Wind Lightning Field and S reputation wouldn't been completely ruined. If Wind Lightning Field were to stop here, at least it could be said that they were gracious in defeat. All of a sudden, Chan Ping and thought of the swordsman Lu Baqiao, who had accompanied him into the mountain in search of model trees, and he said, Wind Lightning Field will definitely fight the third battle. To Chun Ping and Lu Baqiao wasn't a friend or a foe. However, among the group of cultivators who had visited the small town from the outside world, he was one that had left a very deep impression on Chan Ping and and he just had a feeling that a sect that could produce a swordsman like Lu Baqiao definitely wouldn't back down just so save face. Sure enough, after a secret 3-way discussion between Wind Snow Temple, Wind Lightning Field, and Sun-Scorched Mountain, the short and childlike master of Wind Snow Temple led a pair of cultivators to the center of the divine platform, where he declared the imminent commencement of the third battle. Sun-Scorched Mountain had sent out Su Jia, and she had a long sword strapped to her back and a sword-nurturing gourd strapped to her waist. As usual, she was truly stunning to behold. The swordsman representing Wind Lightning Field was the final disciple of the field master, and his name was Huang He. He carried a massive sword case on his back, and it was unclear whether there was a single massive sword inside or multiple smaller swords. Almost everyone in S attention was focused on the young swordsman and swordswoman, but in contrast, Chan Ping and was circulating the true qi within his body, and his gaze was directed toward the cluster of buildings on the divine platform, trying to find a certain person. The scroll was only so large, but one of the main reasons this practice was so popular was that qi refiners and martial artists both had far superior eyesight compared with the average person. Immortals saw a grain of sand as just that, whereas a Tao ancestor could see an entire world. All of a sudden a cold gleam flashed through Chan Ping and S eyes as he picked up a few sparrow and S tongue tea leaves to chew on. Standing in the corridor on the top floor of a tall building was an imposing elderly man dressed in a white robe. His arms were crossed in front of his chest as he looked down at the plaza on the divine platform, and there was a little girl with a set of intricate features straddled across his shoulders. The elderly man was standing slightly to the right relative to the center, and all of those next to him were extremely esteemed figures on sun-scorched mountain, giving off a vast collective aura that rose straight up into the heavens. Chan Ping and Appos, and stared intently at the old man in white for a moment, then shifted his gaze toward another tall building, this one having been assigned to Wind Lightning Field and Appos' cultivators by the divine platform. There were very few swordsmen standing on this building. In contrast with Sun-Scorched Mountain, which had sent out virtually all of its swordsmen of the middle 5 tiers, Wind Lightning Field had barely sent anyone to the event, and most of them appeared quite young. For example, Lu Baqiao was seated on the railing in an uncouth posture, but despite his lackadaisical demeanor, there was a grim look in his eyes in the wake of the 2 consecutive defeats suffered by Wind Lightning Field. Zhang Shan was intently scrutinizing the unfolding scene, and he murmured to himself, "It and Appos' about to begin." Qiu Shi smiled as she said, "For the first 2 battles, both sides were aiming to kill one another. However, the outcome of this battle is inconsequential, so I and Appos' am assuming it and Appos' will be more of a back-and-forth affair, and one and Appos' be as fierce as the previous 2. Chan Ping and Appos' and refrained from offering any opinion on the matter. His thoughts were still primarily lingering on that mountain-moving ape of Sun-Scorched Mountain. Chan Ping and Appos' and silently committed to memory all of the faces that he could see on the pavilion assigned to the Sun-Scorched Mountain cultivators. Only by knowing the enemy could he be best prepared. Compared with hearing about these people from others, it was far more reliable to see them with his own 2 eyes. Perhaps these people were going to stand in his way during his future ascent to the mountaintop, so they were all potential enemies of his. Of course, he was still very far away from reaching that point. After all, at this moment he was still only a 3rd-tier martial artist. The old man wearing the mink fur hat mused, "That lass by the name of Sujia is most likely not in for a good time." The young swordsman situated to the far right was habitually patting the scabbard of his swords as he nodded in agreement. "Her loss is sealed. It and Appos' too bad that the sword nurturing gourd fell into her hands. I Don and Appos' think you and Appos' be able to find a 3rd such sword nurturing gourd even on the entire complete Reed continent." Sure enough, the battle concluded after only 3 exchanges. Su Jia had drawn her sword and released the bonded flying sword from her sword nurturing gourd, but she was still comprehensively defeated by Huang He. As it turned out, the huge sword casket on his back was filled with small swords, and it was as if he were carrying a hornet and Appos' nest on his back. There was no single bonded flying sword. Instead, he excelled in controlling a large number of flying swords at once, and Su Jia was completely powerless to retaliate. One sword pierced through her sword-wielding arm, another severed the red rope that tied her sword nurturing gourd to her belt, and finally, a pair of flying swords pierced through her wrists. By the time she fell onto the ground in a puddle of her own blood, she had already fallen unconscious. There Waren and Appos' that many truly widely admired celestial maidens on Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. The former Jade Girl He Xiaoyang was undoubtedly at the top of the list, following which were Su Jia and 3 or 4 other women. They were goddesses who had descended into the mortal realm in the eyes of countless young male chi refiners, and they were showered with love and admiration. There were even some who jokingly claimed that ever since Su Jia made a name for herself, the yearly new disciple intake for Sun-Scorched Mountain had increased by as much as 30%. Huang He was standing beside Su Jia, and he raised a foot before stepping down onto that exceptional sword nurturing gourd, gently rolling it back and forth underfoot. The corners of his lips then curled up slightly as he swept his gaze across her surroundings, then finally settled his gaze on the pavilion where all of the esteemed figures of Sun-Scorched Mountain were gathered. An inky black bonded flying sword flew out of his glabella, and it was buzzing audibly. As soon as the flying sword emerged, the originally tranquil wind and clouds around the entire divine platform were instantly swept up into a chaotic frenzy. After that public display of provocation, Huang He withdrew his bonded flying sword, then declared toward the pavilion, "In 60 years I and Appos' will be visiting Sun-Scorched Mountain to issue a challenge, and I and Appos' I'll be claiming another head to be placed in our wind lightning field. An elderly founder of Sun-Scorched Mountain standing on the top floor of the pavilion was furious to hear this, and he was barely able to suppress the urge to storm onto the plaza and stomp this arrogant little bastard to death. All of a sudden, the doors of the top floor of the pavilion where Wind Lightning Field and Oppos' cultivators were situated opened, and a handsome black-robed swordsman emerged from within, then cast his gaze toward the elderly founder of Sun-Scorched Mountain as he jibed, "It and Oppos. It's not good for old men like us to pick on these juniors. If you want to fight, then how about I be your opponent?" As soon as this swordsman emerged from the pavilion, not only was that elderly founder of Sun-Scorched Mountain stunned into silence, all of the other Sun-Scorched Mountain cultivators were also completely astonished, and a hint of despair had surfaced in their eyes. This man was none other than the master of Wind Lightning Field, Li Tuanjing. He was truly a prodigious swordsman, reaching the 10th tier at just 40 years of age, but what was very strange about him was that he hadn't Oppos' advanced any further in his cultivation base during the next few centuries after that. However, even though he hadn't Oppos' advanced to the upper 5 tiers, he was still considered to be among the handful of most formidable swordsmen on the entire Eastern Treasured Vile continent, certainly the most fearsome of all of the continent and Oppos' 10th tier swordsmen. Prior to reaching the 11th tier, Wei Jin had also admitted that he was no match for Li Tuanjing. Wasn't Oppos' he supposed to have passed away? Li Tuanjing paid no further heed to the bewildered Sun-Scorched Mountain cultivators as he raised his head with a smile, seemingly casting his gaze toward all of the people spectating the battles from behind the scenes. He then clasped a hand behind his back before joining the index and middle fingers of his other hand, then gently swept those 2 fingers through the air with a flick of his wrist. A gentle breeze was instantly released from his fingertips before transforming into a streak of vast sword qi, and it circled around in the sky above the divine platform, severing the connection between the divine platform and the outside world. All of the people in the scroll were completely astonished, while those outside of it were just as flabbergasted. Standing on the tall pavilion on the divine platform, Li Tuanjing didn't Oppos' attack the Sun-Scorched Mountain cultivators, nor did he issue any threats. Instead, he merely observed the drifting clouds in the distance, seemingly in a daze. The cultivators of Wind Snow Temple were quite relieved to see this. As the most formidable 10th tier swordsman, Li Tuanjing and Oppos' powers were nearly unmatched. Whenever a chi refiner was considered to be the best among a certain group, especially in the context of an entire continent, then they were sure to be extremely fearsome. For example, back when Song Chongjing was considered to be the most formidable 9th-tier martial artist on the continent, it was said that he had already displayed 10th-tier combat prowess during that battle in the capital city. The person who had broken Li Tuanjing and Oppos' record to become the youngest 10th-tier swordsman in the history of the continent was none other than Wei Jin, and at this point, he was already an immortal of the upper 5 tiers. Huang He slowly returned to the pavilion with his sword casket on his back, while the Sun-Scorched Mountain cultivators hurriedly sent out people to retrieve Su Jia. This entire time, Li Tuanjing merely stood with a smile on his face and his hands clasped behind his back. Even if I and Oppos' am on the cusp of drawing my final breath, I and Oppos' am going to exert my dominance over your Sun-Scorched Mountain to the very end. Even if your remains are taken back to Sun-Scorched Mountain, they still won and Oppos' feel any sense of accomplishment over the deed. You broke my heart 300 years ago, and in return I and Oppos' dominated your entire Sun-Scorched Mountain for 300 whole years. Those juniors of yours who were fortunate enough to have become sword immortals are too embarrassed to even hold celebratory ceremonies, and they can only cower on the mountaintop, lamenting their own incompetence. So what if I and Oppos' am going to die today? Are you happy now? Li Tuanjing cast aside his train of thought as he made his way downstairs, gently patting the banister as he did so. Arriving on the lower floor, he made his way over to a young man and Oppos' side. The young man was none other than Lu Baqiao, and his lips were quivering as he stared into space. It must be a very bad feeling seeing the woman you love being humiliated and having her Dao heart crumble, only to be unable to jump in and save her because you and Oppos' from opposing camps, Li Tuanjing said with a smile. Lu Baqiao immediately snapped back to his senses, and he was just about to jump down from the railing, but Li Tuanjing laid a hand onto his shoulder to stop him. There and Appos. No need to stand up, just remain seated. A guilty look appeared on Lu Baqiao and Appos' face. Fieldmaster. Li Tuanjing smiled as he said, it and Appos. Alright. So what if you and Appos fallen in love with a woman that you shooed and Appos t? It and Appos. Not like the sky is going to fall. There and Appos. No need to feel guilty over something. Lu Baqiao didn't and Appos know how to respond. He was unable to shake off the guilt that he felt toward Li Tuanjing, nor was he willing to lie. After suffering such a crushing mental and physical blow, Su Jiao will most likely fall into obscurity, and even have her sword-nurturing gourd taken away by sun-scorched mountain. With her Dao heart destroyed, she and Appos will be knocked down from her pedestal, and she and Appos will only be a shell of the celestial maiden that all of you formerly revered and admired. Perhaps she won and Appos even be able to compare with the average female cultivator of sun-scorched mountain. All I want to know is, would you still love her if all of that came to transpire? I and Appos will still be in love with her until the day I die, Lu Baqiao sobbed. I and Appos am really pathetic, aren't and Appos ti Fieldmaster? This is a good thing, you foolish boy, Li Tuanjing sighed. In that case, continue to love her, but don't and Appos let that get in the way of your cultivation. You and Appos someone that I and Appos always had very high hopes for, and I don't and Appos think you and Appos inferior to Huang He in the slightest. I didn't and Appos tell you this before, as there was no point, and I and Appos am saying this to you now as I won and Appos get a chance to do it beyond this point. Lu Baqiao turned to Li Tuanjing upon hearing this. What do you mean, Fieldmaster? Li Tuanjing didn't and Appos respond to the question. Instead he said, keep working hard in your swordsmanship, and strive to bury my remains together with those remains. Let me ask you another question. If the fortunes of our two sects are reversed, and sun-scorched mountain rises up to dominate our wind lightning field, what would you do? Lu Baqiao immediately jumped down from the railing, standing in the corridor with a serious look as he replied, we are swordsmen, so we naturally let our swords do the talking. You are the spitting image of my younger self. Li Tuanjing chuckled. He then cast his gaze into the distance with a smile on his face as he continued, unfortunately, when it comes to love, that kind of mindset simply one and Appos do. Just because you and Appos an exceptional swordsman doesn't and Appos mean your sword can sort out all of your problems. When speaking to the woman of your heart, you have to be more gentle and say some romantic things. At this moment, Huang He slowly emerged from the stairwell, and Li Tuanjing turned to face the two young men with a carefree smile on his face. After I die, the wind lightning field will fall upon the shoulders of you two. I can shoulder that responsibility on my own, master, Huang He said with a cold expression. That would be great. I wouldn't and Appos have to do any work then, Lu Baqiao said with a mischievous grin. Li Tuanjing burst into laughter, and he pointed at Huang He as he declared, you will have the swordsman and Appos' boundless power and resounding reputation. He then pointed his finger at Lu Baqiao as he continued, whereas you will have the swordsman and Appos' grace and affinity for fine wine and women. In the end, he concluded with a pleased expression, our wind lightning field will have it all. On the Kuan ship that was bound for Southern Stream Nation, the burly man beside the woman jeered. That swordsman in black at the end was decent, but overall, those 3 battles were completely mediocre. If this were on our complete reed continent, there and Appos' no way any two sects would and Appos been shameless enough to make such a big fuss, only to put on such a mediocre display. The woman nodded with a smile as she mused, that sword-nurturing gourd is quite exceptional. I wonder if we and Appos will have a chance to purchase it. The old woman standing next to her smiled as she said, as long as you make your intentions known, I and Appos am sure they and Appos will be willing to hand over the sword-nurturing gourd to you, mistress. The old man wearing the mink fur hat was becoming increasingly more disgruntled by the constant chatter that he was hearing. From the very beginning of the first battle, the people around him had been commentating non-stop, going on and on about how terrible the quality of the battles had been, and it seemed that they would never stop talking. The old man turned to the side before spitting disdainfully onto the ground. Their swordsmanship is indeed lacking compared with the sword immortals of our complete reed continent, But those 3 battles had still been quite riveting to watch nonetheless. What else do you want to see out of this? It sounds like you have a death wish, the tall and imposing man said in a cold voice. So what if I do? The old man retorted with a cold voice. How about we have a battle ourselves? If the battles between Wind Lightning Field and Sunscorched Mountain were so mediocre in your eyes, then let and oppose. Show everyone what a good battle looks like. If I lose you can do whatever you want to me, but if I win I get to bang your wife for 3 days and 3 nights, what do you think? The timid man beside the woman immediately stepped in to act as mediator, interjecting in a meek voice, there and oppose. No need to turn to violence, let and oppose. All be civilized and talk things out. We and oppose. All from complete reed continent, so let and oppose. All get along. Not only was the tall and thin woman not infuriated to hear this, she turned to size up the old man with an amused smile as she chuckled, you and oppose. A little too old for me. That waist of yours would probably snap after going only a few rounds with me. Fighting in bed and fighting out of bed are 2 entirely different matters, Wooden and oppose. Do you agree, you old fart? The old man spat onto the ground once again. You sure talk big for someone who and oppose. As thin as a bamboo stick. I and oppose. I'll take you and your man and fuck both of you up. Chun Ping and oppose, and was listening to the verbal altercation with a flabbergasted expression, feeling as if he had returned to Clay Vase Alley or Apricot Blossom Alley. The young swordsman seated to the far right was growing rather disgruntled, and he complained, if you and oppose, gonna fight, then hurry up and fight. Quit dirtying our ears with your trash talk. This was another short-tempered individual, and not only was he not mediating, he was fanning the flames even further. Chun Ping and oppose, and was feeling a little concerned that a battle was actually about to break out. Meanwhile, the swordswoman whose hair was arranged into a bun that was held together by a small sword paid no heed to the commotion around her, merely staring at the scroll with a contemplative expression, as if she were reminiscing about the battles that she had just watched. Thankfully, the ship owner intervened in a timely fashion, approaching everyone with a smile before sweeping his gaze across all of the people involved in the altercation. At the same time, he cupped his fist in a salute, calling out the individuals one by one as his gaze settled upon them. Mr. Swordurn, Mistress Azurebone, young Master Hulu, would it be possible for you to set your differences aside for now? If so, that would be much appreciated. The 3 individuals involved could easily ignore the ship owner, and they could even completely disregard Ceremony Mountain without any consequences. However, after their names were called out by the ship owner, things became very simple. The old man with the nickname of Swordurn was an extremely strange swordsman in the southern region of complete reed continent. He was only at the Golden Courtier and didn't and oppose, belong to any sect, but he excelled in nurturing swords in antiquated urns, and he would often nurture the flying swords of swordsmen of the middle 5 tiers free of charge. As a result, he had friends all over the entire continent. Mistress Azurebone wasn't an oppose, a swordswoman, but she had a godfather who was a 10th tier swordsman and was extremely protective of his juniors. Furthermore, he possessed an extremely formidable divine weapon, and in addition to that, Mistress Azurebone herself was also a 7th tier martial artist whose forte was close quarters combat, and she had earned quite a fearsome reputation for herself. As for the young swordsman and oppose, Hulu's surname, that was an extremely renowned surname all over complete reed continent. Presiding over their clan was an unpolished jade tier sword immortal, and he was one of the sword immortals who had led the charge to Stalactite Mountain. He had a very honest and frank personality, and he was a good friend of the Tao Master of complete reed continent, Xianxia. The current clan leader of the Hulu clan was the chief military governor of the large empire situated in the eastern region of complete reed continent. He was an oppose, endowed with the natural gifts required for cultivation, and he was just a frail scholar with no cultivation base at all, yet he controlled an almighty army of 300,000 troops. Furthermore, there were over 1,000 swordsmen under his command, earning him the revered title of Thousand Swordsman Scholarly General. Ceremony Mountain wasn't an oppose, exactly afraid of these 3 parties, but that wasn't an oppose, because it possessed sufficient power to contend against the likes of the Hulu clan. Instead, it was because Ceremony Mountain was simply too far away for the Hulu clan to be able to do anything to it. As for Mistress Azurebone and Mr. Swordurn, Ceremony Mountain naturally wasn't an oppose, T afraid of them either, but seeing as they were esteemed guests, there was obviously no reason to make enemies out of them. Mr. Sword Earn was quite taken aback to hear this, and he leaned forward slightly as he turned to the young swordsman, then asked in a loud voice, "How are you related to Hulu Inzi?" "He and Appos. S my uncle, but he and Appos. S been in seclusion for many years." "You know him?" the young swordsman replied in a hostile voice. Mr. Sword Earn slapped himself on the leg as he burst into laughter. Back in the day, Hulu Inzi was the most boring young man you could ever imagine. I was the one who took him to a brothel for the first time. After that, he would always follow me around. Prior to that, I had only ever heard of people freeloading off others for food and shelter. But your uncle is the only one I and Appos we ever met who freeloaded off someone else for prostitution. The young swordsman and Appos' face instantly became flushed with embarrassment upon hearing this, and he hurriedly took a careful glance at the swordswoman beside him. Only after verifying that she was displaying no reaction to this did he heave an internal sigh of relief before turning back to the old man as he declared in a righteous voice, "My uncle Isen and Appos, T that type of person." The old man rolled his eyes in response. "Your uncle and I are so close that we and Appos, we seen each other and Appos' dicks before. A kid like you doesn't and Appos. T no shit." The young swordsman was stunned into complete silence upon hearing this. The swordswoman was unable to maintain her silence any longer, and she snapped in a furious voice, "Shut your mouth." "Oh, what a feisty little lass," the old man chuckled. "You and Appos re gonna have your hands full dealing with her, kid." The young swordsman knew that something bad was about to happen, but there was no time for him to issue a verbal warning. A frosty look had appeared on the swordswoman and Appos' face, and she said in a cold voice, "You need to have teeth smashed in so you know not to speak in such a foul manner." The tiny flying sword being used to hold her hair in place immediately flew out of her hair and flashed through the air, leaving a trail of bright white light behind it. Flying swords were renowned for their extraordinary speed and how difficult they were to defend against, and this tiny flying sword was even faster than the average flying sword, reaching a phenomenal speed that astonished all of the onlookers, including Chun Ping and Appos. And, "Ow! That hurts like a bitch," the old man yelled in a muffled voice as he clapped his hands over his own mouth, out of which blood was flowing incessantly. As it turned out, the flying sword had pierced through his lips and smashed one of his front teeth. However, instead of being terrified or infuriated, the old man burst into laughter, seemingly extremely excited by what he had seen. He slapped his own legs vigorously, and even as blood and spittle were flying out of his mouth, he yelled, as expected of one of the fastest flying swords of our complete reed continent, "Your lightning truly lives up to its resounding reputation." Even Mistress Azurebone Kuden and Appos helped but feel a little intimidated upon seeing this. That swordswoman was another descendant of a clan with a sword immortal clan head. Furthermore, in contrast with the Hulu clan, which was an extremely large and formidable clan, the previous owner of lightning was all on his own, but that certainly didn't end Appos mean he was lacking in power. He had once traveled the perilous Middle-earth divine continent on his own, armed with nothing more than his two swords, fearsome Rhino and Lightning, Chun Ping and Appos, and was naturally oblivious to all of these secrets concerning these formidable figures of complete reed continent, and they were all conversing in the official dialect of complete reed continent, so he had no idea what they were saying, but it was clear to him that a storm was brewing. Hence, he was seated in his chair in an alert fashion, getting ready to run away at the first sign of trouble. Thankfully, through the conversations that he had had with Chun Shui and Qiu Shi these past few days, he had learned that it wasn't Appos a strange occurrence to be encountering immortals from all walks of life on the Kuan ship crossing through 3 continents, so he knew not to be overtly alarmed. As for below the Kuan ship, there weren't and Appos actually that many formidable figures. Not only was this the case on the tiny eastern treasured Vile continent, the same applied to complete reed continent as well, despite its vast size and huge population of swordsmen. After recovering her flying sword, the swordswoman turned to the ship owner with an apologetic smile, much to the latter and Appos' relief. In the wake of her aggressive intervention, things had become even simpler, and the matter was going to be quickly settled. Sure enough, all 3 sides quickly lost interest in the confrontation, and the tense atmosphere had completely faded away. back in the small town or on downtrodden mountain, Changping and Appos, and had never felt like the world was an evil or dangerous place, and he certainly wasn't Appos, anywhere near as numb and cynical as the little boy in Azure had been. However, after witnessing those 3 battles and seeing a fight almost break out between these powerful cultivators right before his eyes, he told himself, Don and Appos, just focus on drinking Changping and Appos, and you have to work harder in your fist technique practice so you can begin your sword training earlier. With that in mind, Changping and Appos, and cast his gaze toward the sky outside the Kuan ship, and he was suddenly filled with a sense of longing for the ability to someday soar through the heavens atop a flying sword alongside the birds in the sky. Ceremony Mountain seemed to have adopted a method similar to rubbing to preserve all of the scenes that had unfolded on the scroll, and one sheet of thin veil-like paper was torn off after another, totaling 10 sheets of paper, which were then sold in auction format. The ship owner specifically called upon Chen Shui and Qiu Shi to step forward and serve as auctioneers. Initially, Changping and Appos, and didn't Appos, think much of this, but he then noticed that even though both Chen Shui and Qiu Shi had been called upon to serve as auctioneers, only Chen Shui was actually doing her job, and she was doing so immaculately, seemingly very familiar with the duties of an auctioneer. In contrast, Qiu Shi was standing off to the side, staring directly at Changping and Appos, and only after seeing him direct his gaze toward her did a pleased look appear on her face, and she raised her chin slightly in a proud manner, as if only now did she feel as if she were standing on equal terms with Changping and Appos, and for once, Changping and Appos, and didn't Appos, really understand what she was thinking, so he turned his attention to the sheets of paper that were being sold instead. Out of the 10 rubbings, each successive one harbored less spiritual qi than the previous one and was also more blurry. Furthermore, the final sheet could only be viewed once, and it was also the cheapest of the lot, starting at a price of only 30 snowflake jade coins. The type of jade used to craft these coins was called snowflake jade, and it was a specialty local product of the northern pure white continent. It was primarily distributed throughout 2 blessed lands, and if these coins were placed under the light of the sun, it would appear as if there were translucent snowflakes drifting around inside. That was why they were also known as minor snow coins. On the front of these coins was inscribed the words prosperous year, while on the back were the words snow-covered ground. Due to the large volumes of production of snowflake jade, and the fact that it contained a considerable amount of spiritual energy, over time, it gradually became the universal currency used by all immortals on the 9 continents. In fact, it was so prevalently used that it was something that low-tier cultivators had to prepare whenever they went on journeys of any considerable length. Snowflake coins could definitely be exchanged for gold and silver, but the reverse wasn't Appos, always guaranteed. The reason for this was very simple. The wealthy and powerful individuals of the mortal world all had their own territories and immortals that they made offerings to, and there was no way that they could make these offerings in the form of carriage loads of gold and silver. That was far too conspicuous and also very cumbersome. In contrast, offering a box of snowflake coins was a far better alternative, and if some special attention were paid to the construction and material of the box, then that would be even better. Changping and Appos, and gritted his teeth to steel himself before purchasing the final one of the 10 pages for 30 minor snow coins. Due to the fact that it was the final one, the ship owner handed it over to Changping and Appos, and in person, Qiu Shi wasn't Appos, as mature and reliable as her sister Chen Shui, and she didn't Appos, have much fear or respect for the ship owner, constantly chirping and prancing around him like a little warbler on a branch. Thankfully, the ship owner had watched the 2 girls grow up their entire lives, and Qiu Shi had superior aptitude to Chen Shui with hopes of reaching the middle 5 tiers someday, so the ship owner had a great deal of patience for her. Essentially, he was seeing her as a long-term investment. For someone like him, who made a living catering to cultivators, he had to look at the big picture and set his sights far into the future. Not only did he have to keep tabs on what was directly in front of him, he had to think many years down the line as well. After all of the sheets of paper were sold, the ship owner played a prank on Qiu Shi, picking up a fire pear from the fruit platter on the table next to the sandalwood chairs and handing it to her, following which he promptly departed. Changping and Appos, and was rather perplexed to see this, but his puzzled gaze was met with a vicious glare from Qiu Shi. As it turned out, This fire pair was her commission for assisting in the sale of the sheets of paper. However, after glaring at Changping and Appo's, a smug smile appeared on Qiu Shi and Appo's face, and she flaunted her fire pair to Chun Shi by waving it in front of her. Following the conclusion of the showdown between Wind Lightning Field and Sun Scorch Mountain, Changping and Appo's parted ways with Zhang Shan, then returned to the Heaven Grade Room C with Chun Shui and Qiu Shi. However, not long after the two parted ways, they met again. As the Kuan ship slowly descended upon the ferry station in Southern Stream Nation, Changping and Appo's and Zhang Shan chose to disembark from the Kuan ship together. There, Changping and Appo's waved farewell to the pair of maidservants, and that spelled the end of their time together. The ferry station in Southern Stream Nation was constructed on a large lake on the border that Southern Stream Nation shared with ancient Elm Nation. In contrast with the ferry station on Parasol Tree Mountain in the Dragon Spring Prefecture, this one was far larger, with 5 Kuan ships able to dock there at the same time. Parting ways with Chun Shui and Qiu Shi hadn't and Appo's exactly been an emotional affair for Changping and Appo's, and during the time that he had spent on the Kuan ship, he had shamelessly asked Ceremony Mountain for many fruits and snacks, and the two maidservants had been direct beneficiaries of this. At some point, the people of Ceremony Mountain began to speculate that Changping and Appo's had to be some short-sighted hillbilly who had never seen the outside world and was keen on taking advantage of all of the free stuff that he could get his hands on. Even if Changping and Appo's had known about this, he wouldn't and Appo's have been bothered, but Qiu Shi was quite unhappy on his behalf, and in the end, Chun Shui was the one going to the Kuan ship and Appo's kitchen to request fruits and snacks. As he disembarked from the Kuan ship, Changping and Appo's was carrying a bunch of fruit peels and cores with him. Due to the fact that there weren't and Appo's many people disembarking from the ship at Southern Stream Nation, Changping and Appo's and Zhang Shan quickly ran into one another, and they decided to travel together. Near the railing of the ship, Qiu Shi harumphed coldly, "Look at how heartless he is, big sister." He wasn't and Appo's sad at all as he left the ship. I bet he and Appo's already thinking about all the women and vices of the mortal world. An exasperated look appeared on Chun Shui and Appo's face as she sighed. "Young Master Chun wasn't and Appo's even interested in Apricot Blossom Tavern. What makes you think he and Appo's be interested in brothels? We and Appo's both seen countless men who and Appo's appeared esteemed and well-mannered on the surface, only to completely succumb to the allure of Apricot Blossom Tavern. The women in the tavern who go out of their way to suck up to them are no inferior to goddesses and celestial maidens in the eyes of mortal men, and after having a few drinks, all of those men immediately show their true colors. If only all men were like young Master Chun. That and Appo's only because Changping and Appo's is still young," Qiu Shi retorted, seemingly completely unconvinced. "Once he grows up, he and Appo's will be just as bad as all of those other men. Perhaps next time he travels on our Kuan ship, he and Appo's will start trying to sweet-talk us and lure us into bed with him." Chun Shui and Appo's eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced at the embroidered pouch hanging from Qiu Shi and Appo's waist as she asked, "Do you really think that?" All of a sudden, Qiu Shi turned around, pretending to not be able to see Changping and Appo's Appo's gesture of farewell. Chun Shui cast her gaze into the distance, and only then did she discover that Changping and Appo's was cupping his fist toward the two of them in a farewell salute, a gesture that was very much befitting a martial artist who practiced his fist technique so earnestly. Chun Shui hurriedly raised an arm to wave farewell in response. Only after Changping and Appo's had turned to depart did Qiu Shi turn back around with a disgruntled look on her face, and Chun Shui was quite amused to see this. "Why do this to yourself? He and Appo's already so far away, it and Appo's not like you and Appo's going to lose a pound of flesh if you just politely bid farewell to him." Qiu Shi took a glance at her sister and Appo's voluptuous chest, and she was fighting back a smirk as she retorted, "Of course with that body of yours, you and Appo's not afraid of losing a pound of flesh, but I can and Appo's afford to spare any flesh from my body." The two immediately erupted into a play fight. After a brief chat, Changping and Appo's and Zhang Shan learned that both of them were planning to travel southward. Changping and Appo's and was doing so for a rather inexplicable reason. Both Lu Chan and Old Man Yang had told him to disembark from the Kuan ship at Southern Stream Nation, so he didn't and oppose. He dared to take the ship to the next ferry station in Old Dragon City instead, even though that wouldn't oppose, been more convenient. As for Zhang Shan, he was simply too impoverished to be able to afford traveling on the ship any longer, and if he didn't and oppose, disembark, then he would most likely have to start working on the ship as a manual laborer just to be able to fill his belly. Personality-wise, the two of them got along quite well with each other, so they agreed to travel southward together. As for when they were going to part ways, it would be a conversation for another time. The ferry station where they had disembarked from the Kuan ship was situated on the border between Southern Stream Nation and Ancient Elm Nation, and Zhang Shan was somewhat fluent in the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, so he began explaining to Chan Ping and Appos, and some things about Ancient Elm Nation. The imperial clan of Ancient Elm Nation was the Chu clan, and there was a story about the origins of the nation and Appos' name. It was said that back in ancient times, there had been a goddess responsible for heralding the arrival of spring, and for the life cycles of all plant life under the heavens. However, there was a large tree in Ancient Elm Nation that was always a little slower to turn green in spring, and a little slower to turn yellow in autumn than all of the other plants, much to the goddess and Appos' annoyance. As punishment, she decreed that this tree was to never attain sentience or intelligence, and that was the origin of the saying of Elmwood Lump. Zhang San was a third-tier qi refiner still yet to consolidate his cultivation base, but as a Taoist priest from the Mount Longhu Taoist orthodoxy, he couldn't and Appos' have been more familiar with the laborious task of traversing mountains and valleys. Prior to entering the mountains, Zhang Shan had pulled out a copper bell from his bags and tied it to the end of his peachwood sword and Appos' hilt. As he did so, he explained to Chan Ping and Appos, "And this is a demon detecting bell, and it and Appos' a very popular item in Taoist circles. It serves a similar purpose to the Baizé album that and Appos' prevalent among qi refiners, but this bell of mine is only one of the lowest tier, so it can only just barely be considered to be a demon-subduing instrument. After being injected with spiritual energy, it can detect demonic beings up to a tier higher than me for a duration of several hours. At the moment I and Appos' am only at the third tier, so it one and Appos' be able to detect any great demons at or above the fifth tier." Chan Ping and Appos' and wanted to say something but refrained from doing so in the end. He was rather perplexed at how easily Zhang Shan had revealed his cultivation base to someone that he had only just met. On top of that, it was rather strange that he was referring to fifth-tier demons as great demons, and this left Chan Ping and Appos' and feeling rather perplexed. Could it be that Zhang Shan wasn't an Appos' from the same world that he was? The little girl in pink and the little boy in azure were both qi refiners of the middle 5 tiers, yet back in Dragontail County, the little boy in azure was constantly going on and on about how worried he was that he would be pummeled to death by a single punch by someone someday. Despite his befuddlement, Chan Ping and Appos' impression of Zhang Shan had improved even further. Zhang Shan was completely oblivious to Chan Ping and Appos' befuddlement, and he was still trying to console him. But Don and Appos' worry, young Master Chan. Everyone in our circles say that no great demons would dare to wreak havoc within a radius of hundreds of kilometers of any territory under the jurisdiction of a righteous immortal sect. The reason for this is very simple. Those great demons simply Don and Appos' have the guts to do anything out of line. Otherwise, if an immortal of the middle 5 tiers hears of what they and Appos' been doing, they could lose their lives the very same day as Sen and Appos'. That right? Chun Ping and Appos' and smiled and nodded in response. Scholars venturing into the mountains to visit immortals had always been a common trope in many stories that had been written throughout the ages, as was the concept of immortals posing as ordinary people to mess around in the mortal world. The mortal and immortal worlds had always been closely interconnected. It was only after he had gotten onto the Kuan ship did Chan Ping and Appos' and come to realize that places like the Dragon Spring Prefecture were extremely rare on the 3 continents, including Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Many mortals would spend their entire lives without seeing a so-called immortal even once. Zhang Shan was a very kind-hearted and hospitable person, and after learning from Chan Ping and Appos', and through their conversation that he wasn't and Appos' even carrying a Baizé album with him, He immediately insisted on giving his Baizé album to Ping and Appos, and telling him that it had only cost him 3 minor snow coins, and that just like his demon detecting bell, it was a very low-quality product that had been made in a private workshop. He proclaimed that it was too shoddy a Baizé album for him to gift to anyone under normal circumstances, but seeing as Ping and Appos, and needed one right now, he could use it to get by for now. In any case, Xianxia had already completely memorized the Baizé album, so he didn't and Appos need it anymore anyway. Ping and Appos, and Wazn and Appos, willing to accept the Baizé album free of charge, so he tucked a hand up his sleeve to conceal it before pulling 2 minor snow coins out of his pocket treasure 15th, then offered them to Xianxia, who hesitated momentarily before only accepting 1 minor snow coin. As he did so, he told Ping and Appos, and that for such an old and low-quality Baizé album, even 1 minor snow coin was too much to ask for. Back when Ping and Appos encountered that female ghost in the red wedding dress, the blind Taoist priest had already given him a mountain scouring album that had been passed down from generations, and it was indeed countless times better than the Baizé album, but Ping and Appos had given it to Lin Shui. Ping and Appos and continued to scale the mountain while flipping through the pages of the Baizé album, and he was very intrigued by what he saw. In particular, there were some images of demons and spirits that hadn't and Appos been recorded in the mountain scouring album, and it felt quite rewarding accumulating this new knowledge. When it came to traversing through mountains, even if Xianxia traveled for 10 more years, he most likely still wouldn't and Appos be able to match Ping and Appos, and Appos' level of proficiency. Ping and Appos was traversing the mountain terrain as if he were taking a stroll in the park, while Xianxia was and Appos exactly gasping for air, but he was definitely proceeding far more laboriously. Unlike when he was back on the Kuan ship, where he had to proceed with caution at all times, Ping and Appos was intentionally making his footsteps heavier and louder. Following his fist technique practice back in the bamboo building, he had learned that he had to relax from time to time so that he wasn't and Appos constantly wound too tightly. Furthermore, traveling on the Kuan ship was completely different from traveling here. Now that he was no longer on the Kuan ship, he didn't and Appos have to be so careful as even the average third-tier martial artist wouldn't and Appos have been in much danger traversing through a nation on their own. Most importantly, Ping and Appos had a great deal of trust in Xianxia. Even though they had only recently met, he felt like they were already old friends, and this was the same feeling that he had gotten back when he first saw Mr. Qi outside the school, or Li Shixing at the Li clan and Appos' manor. Ping and Appos had faith in his own instincts. As the two of them continued to travel together, 20 days quickly passed by, and their journey continued to progress quite smoothly without a hitch. During this time, Ping and Appos and Xianxia had also grown closer and closer with one another, to the point that Ping and Appos would begin practicing his 6-step walking meditation in front of Xianxia without any inhibitions, and whenever they took some time to rest, he would practice his seated meditation. As for Xianxia, he was coincidentally cultivating the 5 lightning righteous technique, which Ping and Appos was obviously not unfamiliar with. During his cultivation, Xianxia would often adopt strange poses, such as standing on one leg while pounding a certain acupoint on his abdomen with a tightly clenched fist and whistling in a rhythmic fashion. At other times, he would press a finger against the arteries in his neck while the index and middle finger of his other hand would be held together. At the same time, his mouth would be tightly shut as he made a humming sound akin to rolling thunder deep in the pit of his stomach. This was the first time that Ping and Appos had ever met anyone who was every bit as diligent and conscientious in their cultivation as he was, and that was most likely the main reason why they were able to get along so well. Not only were they willing to put in the hard yards, they reveled in the process. Occasionally, the two of them would seek out some shelter at night in an ancient temple or a cave, and they would light a fire. Over the campfire, Xianxia would tell Ping and Appos stories about how formidable the swordsmen of complete Reed continent were, and how Taoist priests were discriminated against. The same treasure or spirit tool could be sold to a swordsman for only 10 light snow coins, but the price would be doubled for a Taoist priest. Even the timid and mild-mannered Xianxia couldn't and Appos helped but grow a little disgruntled when he talked about this, and an extremely rare look of anger would appear on his face. He also declared that if it were possible, he would definitely do something to change this state of affairs. After learning that Qian Ping and oppose, and was a martial artist, Zhang Shan had actually felt quite perplexed. If qi refinement were considered to be the most costly endeavor under the heavens, then practicing martial arts was most definitely the undisputed second most expensive pursuit, one that also ate up an enormous amount of money and resources. Ever since leaving Mount Longhu, Zhang Shan hadn't oppose. He lived a single day in comfort or luxury. Whenever he did manage to acquire any money or resources, he would reluctantly exchange them for life-saving talismans or a suitable demon-subduing treasure or two. Even the simplest divine movement talisman could allow him to make a swift escape if he were to ever come across a great demon, quickly taking him several kilometers away. However, just a single one of those talismans cost 30 snowflake coins, and a single snowflake coin was worth at least 100 taels of silver. This meant that if Zhang Shan had grown up in a mortal family, then he wouldn't oppose. V had to earn at least 3,000 taels of silver just to be able to purchase a single divine movement talisman. As a third-tier qi refiner, Zhang Shan had embarked on an arduous southbound journey across complete Reed continent, which was absolutely rife with swordsmen, and he had nothing to rely on but his rather lackluster abilities. The majority of the demons that he had subdued had actually been nothing more than wandering spirits, while the fiends that he had eradicated had mostly consisted of lost ghosts that were still yet to attain intelligence. Earning money had been very difficult for him, and at times, he would even lose money if he were to encounter a formidable second-tier demon. The truly lucrative jobs were liberation rites of water and land, weddings, and funerals. In particular, events that required the presence of a large number of Taoist priests were always the best source of income, but they were always few and far between. Hence, after hearing about how Taoism was much more revered and respected on Eastern Treasured Vile Continent than on complete Reed Continent, he had made up his mind to travel southward to the former to see if he could find some opportunities for himself, but he had almost starved to death not long after he got on the Kuan ship, and that had severely dampened his enthusiasm for this journey to Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Ancient Elm Nation wasn't oppose. A very large nation, and it didn't oppose. Take long before the two of them crossed over the border to arrive in Colorful Garment Nation. As they were traveling one night, they encountered a heavy storm. At the time they had been in a secluded mountain range, and what was rather strange was that even after traveling for close to 10 kilometers through that mountain range, they still weren't oppose. Able to find a single suitable place to take shelter in. The area was riddled with jagged rocks and steep cliff faces, and the occasional large trees that they came across had all wilted, while the rare living trees that they encountered were far too small to provide any meaningful shelter. Hence, they were forced to brave the heavy rain, which was pelting them with relentless force. Inside the bamboo building on Downtrodden Mountain, Qian Ping and Oppo's physical constitution had been honed to an extreme extent, so he was naturally completely unbothered by this. However, Zhang San had only recently reached the third tier, and qi refiners weren't oppose. Is physically hardy as pure martial artists to begin with, so his lips had turned blue, while his complexion had become deathly pale. Qian Ping and oppose, and knew that if things were to continue, even if Zhang Shan could make it through the night, he was definitely going to fall so ill the next day that he wouldn't oppose be able to travel at all. Qian Ping and oppose, and stopped in his tracks, then laid a hand onto Zhang Shan and oppose's shoulder before instructing him to remain still on the spot and try to maintain a stable rhythm in his breathing to the best of his abilities, having to yell over the sound of the heavy rain as he did so. In the meantime, he would go ahead on his own to find shelter, and regardless of the outcome of his search, he would return to Zhang Shan and oppose's side within 15 minutes. Zhang Shan faltered slightly upon hearing this, and he was already in a rather dazed and disoriented state. He said something in response, but his voice was so feeble that Qian Ping and oppose, and couldn't and oppose, hear him at all over the sound of the rain. He could see Zhang Shan and oppose's condition deteriorating by the minute, and he knew that he couldn't and oppose allow Zhang Shan to be exposed to the elements any longer. With that in mind, Qian Ping and oppose, and didn't and oppose hesitate any longer, giving Zhang Shan a reassuring smile before quickly trudging off on his own. Meanwhile, Zhang Shan sat down with his legs crossed and tried to ward off the cold to the best of his abilities. For qi refiners, the lower 5 tiers were also known as the mountain ascending 5 tiers, and it involved drawing upon the external spiritual energy of heaven and earth to refine the body. The first and second tiers were called the copper skin tier and the grassroot tier, and during those tiers qi refiners attained more resilient bodies and more abundant vitality. Theoretically speaking, no matter how heavy a storm was, a qi refiner of the willow tendon tier should and oppose have been able to ward off the cold, seeing as they were already able to draw upon the spiritual energy of heaven and earth to refine their tendons and bones. However, as a disciple of Mount Longhu, Xianxia was influenced by the talismanic branch of Taoist cultivation, which relied more on external objects, like divine movement talismans and peachwood swords. As a result, his physical refinement was rather lacking, and this storm was particularly heavy and punishing, so the true qi in his body was being sapped away at a rapid rate. Xianxia and Appo's vision was quite blurry due to the heavy rainfall and his feeble condition, and he was internally debating whether he should take off his bags and consume a qi replenishing pill from his clay vial. However, even the cheapest yang restoration pill still cost an entire snowflake coin, and he couldn't and Appo's bear to waste one, so he could only grit his teeth and persevere, hoping that Changping and Appo's and would return soon with good news. Having embarked on the path of cultivation, one had to be prepared to suffer as cultivators did. Those in the mortal world often romanticize the pursuit of cultivation by seeing it through rose-tinted glasses, but in reality, it was an extremely arduous journey that was fraught with suffering and hardships. After quickly walking out of Xianxia and Appo's line of sight, Changping and Appo's and didn't and Appo's conceal his third-tier cultivation base any longer, forging ahead at a rapid speed. He spotted yet another wilted tree up ahead with only its bare branches remaining, and after completing a run-up of a few steps, he ran his way up the trunk of the tree, then grabbed onto one of its decaying branches, using it to launch himself upward. The branch quickly snapped before falling to the ground, but at this point Changping and Appo's and had already launched himself up into the air and landed higher up the tree. He cast his gaze forward, and he spotted a small hill in the distance. He squatted down slightly before launching himself off the branch that he was standing on, and the entire tree toppled to the ground behind him while he flew through the air. He was flying diagonally downward, and he landed at the speed of an arrow. He reached out to break his fall with his hands, sending mud and water splashing in all directions. Then he somersaulted forward, and as soon as his feet landed on the ground, he launched himself forward once again while maintaining a low center of gravity, moving in an extremely quick and agile fashion. It didn't and Appo's take long before he reached that small hill, yet even after scaling to the top of the hill, he was still unable to spot any shelter from his new vantage point. This was rather vexing to Changping and Appo's, and he was beginning to consider chopping down some branches on the way back to set up a makeshift tent. However, given Xianxia and Appo's current condition, even if he could take shelter in a tent, he would most likely still end up falling ill anyway if a fire couldn't be lit. At this point, Changping and Appo's was beginning to grow quite perplexed. It was very strange for such a large area in a mountain range to be so featureless and completely devoid of shelter. He had traveled across many types of terrain in the past, but never had he encountered a place that was quite so withered and bleak. If they had been in a sinister graveyard, then perhaps this would and Appo's been fitting, but why was it that even the rain that was falling here was so much colder than the rain elsewhere? Right as Changping and Appo's was planning to return the same way he had come to get back to Xianxia, he suddenly spotted a glimmer of light in the distance, right at the limits of his visual abilities. The glimmer of light was slowly moving northward, swaying gently in the rain like a small raft bobbing up and down in a turbulent sea, looking as if it could capsize and be snuffed out at any moment. After a brief moment of contemplation, Changping and Appo's memorized the direction that the glimmer of light was moving in, then quickly turned around and returned to Xianxia and Appo's side. After helping Xianxia to his feet, he told him that there was someone else who was also traveling through the night up ahead, and that he planned to catch up to them. If they were from the local area, perhaps they would know where they could find some shelter. Xianxia was slightly reinvigorated upon hearing this, and Changping and Appo's immediately slung him onto his back before rushing into the night. Even though he was carrying a locust wood sword case on his back along with Xianxia, He was still able to run through the stormy night at a remarkable speed, traversing the mountain terrain as if it were flat ground. Xianxia was rowing drowsier by the second, while the glimmer of light up ahead was growing brighter and brighter. Changping and opposed, and slowed down slightly as he cast his gaze forward to find that there were two other people walking side by side in the rain up ahead. It was a pair of young men who appeared to be scholars, with bookcases on their backs. One of them was holding a large umbrella, while the other was holding a lit torch, and even though they appeared to be just as impoverished as Changping and Oppo's duo, they were clearly in far better spirits, smiling as they chatted amicably with one another. It was as if they found the storm to be something that was worthy of celebration rather than a bothersome thing that was slowing their progress. Furthermore, neither of them seemed to have detected the approaching Changping and Oppo's, and he was put slightly at ease upon seeing this. Here in the stormy wilderness, any abnormal occurrences definitely spelled bad news, and if anything were to go wrong, he couldn't and Oppo's just abandoned Zhongshan, so a hard battle would surely follow. From some distance away, Changping and Oppo's yelled out to the pair of traveling scholars up ahead in the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, but the two of them continued onward, seemingly having failed to hear him. Changping and Oppo's was quite relieved to see this. Given their limited hearing capabilities, even if those two were chi refiners or demonic beings, they couldn't and Oppo's have been all that powerful. Of course, that was under the assumption they weren't and Oppo's intentionally hiding their powers. Only when Changping and Oppo's had reached within 20 paces of the pair of scholars did they finally notice him, and they hurriedly stopped in their tracks and beckoned to him. After a brief conversation, one of the scholars from Colorful Garment Nation took a sympathetic glance at the deathly pale Zhongshan, then pointed in a certain direction as he said, "Traveling is one of my greatest hobbies, and I often go on long journeys alone. While it and Oppo's true that this place is quite barren and desolate, I do recall that there and Oppo's a courtyard around 2 kilometers away. There and Oppo's a very good chance that it was built by a hermit, and that and Oppo's exactly where Brother Lu and I are heading right now, so you can come with us if you and Oppo's like." The other umbrella-bearing scholar chimed in with a wry smile. "We were originally camping on a hill about half a kilometer away, and we were caught completely off guard by this storm. If it ISN and Oppo's for the fact that Brother Chu knows his way around these parts really well, I would and Oppo's been in huge trouble on my own." Changping and Oppo's hurriedly expressed his thanks to the pair of scholars. Despite the fact that they had only just met, the umbrella-bearing scholar was willing to hold his umbrella over Zhongshan, even at the expense of exposing himself to the rain, and he quickly began to shiver from the cold. Even though the oil used in the torch wasn't and Oppo's just any ordinary oil, it was still unable to withstand the direct rainfall, and without the cover provided by the umbrella, it was quickly snuffed out, but the scholar couldn't and Oppo's bear to toss it away, so he could only hold it in his arms. With the torch snuffed out, the scholar could only rely on the brief flashes of lightning and his memory to try and find the way forward. After a while they really did arrive at a courtyard. It resembled the estate of a moderately wealthy clan in the city, with a pair of rather petite stone lions on either side of the gates. However, for some unknown reason, there were no couplets hanging outside, nor were there any door gods on the gates. In any case, at the very least, they had an eave under which they could take shelter and catch their breath. After folding up his umbrella, the scholar began to pound vigorously on the gate. It was rude to be pounding on someone and Oppo's door at night, but given the urgency of the situation, it couldn't and Oppo's be helped. Only after a long while had passed did the gate swing open, and it coincided with a flash of lightning in the sky, momentarily illuminating a gaunt and terrifying face. The scholar was so frightened by the sight of this face that he stumbled back and almost fell onto his backside. It was the face of an elderly woman, and its shadows were significantly exaggerated by the flash of lightning. Even Changping and Oppo's, who had seen many demons and spirits up to this point, was given quite a fright, so the scholar certainly couldn't and Oppo's be faulted for his reaction. All of a sudden, it occurred to everyone that it may not necessarily be safer or warmer in the courtyard than it was outside. The deathly pale and hunchbacked old woman was staring blankly at Changping and Oppo's group. The scholar who had knocked on the door had a very cowardly personality, and he didn't and Oppo's T even dared to look directly at the old woman as he hid behind his companion, internally kicking himself for being so eager to step forward and knock on the door. The scholar was quite an avid reader of various types of different books, and he had read no lack of stories concerning all manners of ghosts and spirits, the majority of which fell into two categories. The first category contained the spirits that were very beautiful and alluring, such as the seductive fox spirits that lured in passing scholars. The second category contained spirits that were ghastly in appearance, and at night their residences would appear to be standard courtyards, but if one were fortunate enough to live to the next day, then they would discover that they had actually spent the entire night in an abandoned graveyard. The scholar holding the torch was a little more courageous than his companion, and he jostled his large bookcase up and down to adjust its position on his back while rubbing his hands together for warmth as he forced a smile onto his face and asked, "Would you be able to take us in for a night, madam? The rain is too heavy, and our friend here has already fallen unconscious from the cold. If we can and oppose, find a warm place for him to stay, he may not be able to make it through the night. Saving lives is one of the best deeds one can do. So please take us in out of the kindness of your heart." The old woman wore a stern expression as she said something in the local dialect, and she seemed to have been asking a question. The scholar could only offer an explanation using the same dialect. The old woman turned her gaze toward Changping and Appos, and then suddenly asked in the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, "You and Appos? Ria martial artist?" Changping and Appos, and nodded in response. The old woman then directed her gaze toward the hilt of the peachwood sword that was strapped to Xianxia and Appos' back. In his conscious state, his breathing had become deeper and more even than when he was conscious. This was one of the remarkable things about qi refiners. Everything they did strove toward a return to simplicity, and that sometimes had rather surprising outcomes. Upon noticing the peachwood sword, the old woman and Appos' eyes narrowed slightly as she asked, "And your friend is a Taoist?" Changping and Appos, and nodded once again. Finally, the old woman turned her attention back to the uneasy umbrella-holding scholar as she asked, "Are you a scholar?" The scholar shook his head in response. "I haven't and Appos made any notable achievements in the imperial examination, so I wouldn't and Appos dare to call myself a scholar." The old woman pursed her lips, then slowly hobbled out of the way as she said, "Seeing as you and Appos all legitimate young men, you can come in and stay the night, but make sure to stay in your rooms and Don and Appos go walking around anywhere without permission. Otherwise, if you alert my master to your presence, then you and Appos will have to bear the consequences on your own. There are braziers in the rooms that you can light yourselves, and there and Appos no need to ask permission before you light them. You and Appos, all guests, and my master Isen and Appos so stingy that he would be bothered by the loss of some firewood." After Changping and Appos, and the others had stepped into the courtyard, the old woman looked around outside momentarily, then quickly shut the gate. The thick and heavy gate was made to appear as light as a feather in her hand, and it was swung shut with ease. This was quite a large estate with 4 sections, and Changping and Appos, and Appos' group was assigned to stay in one of those sections. There, they were told that they were forbidden from going into the courtyard in the back. The rooftops of the estate bore engravings of all types of beasts, birds, and scenery, while the window frames had also been intricately crafted. The ground in the courtyard was paved with azure and red bricks, making it very clear where the main paths were. There were also corridors tucked under the eaves that sheltered one from the rain during storms. Upon stepping into one of the corridors under the eaves, the old woman completely vanished into the shadows. Right at this moment there was a flash of lightning, and the 2 scholars caught a glimpse of the old woman and Appos' deathly pale smiling face, a sight so terrifying that they almost passed out on the spot before hurriedly making their way into the nearby room. Still spooked by what they had just seen, the 2 scholars who had the surnames of Chu and Lu didn't and Appos dare to go to bed on their own, so they could only stay together in the same room for now. The scholar with the Lu surname set down his oil paper umbrella, then lit a lamp to read some sagely scriptures in order to calm his jangling nerves. The scholar with the Chu surname was a bit more courageous. Otherwise he wouldn't and Appos have been aware of this estate and Appos' existence. He set down the torch and began to fiddle with the brazier, pulling some fire sticks that were wrapped tightly in oil paper from his bookcase. With those, he was able to quickly light a fire, and the room began to gradually warm up. After that, he inspected his surroundings momentarily, then patted the bed in the room to find that the blankets were slightly damp and were giving off a slightly rank and moldy odor. This was only to be expected. Ever since the beginning of spring this year, it had been raining virtually constantly in colorful Garment Nation, so the blankets in a vacant guest room naturally weren't and oppose going to be in the ideal condition. In any case, it was already very fortunate that they had a place to stay at all, and the scholar certainly wasn't oppose going to criticize the estate owner over something. The scholar with the Chu surname was quite handsome with a tall and slim figure, and his hair was bound neatly within an azure bandana. There was a disposition of righteousness about him, and as he inspected his surroundings, he discovered that the window frames were very intricately crafted with things like bats and carp engraved onto them, all of which had positive connotations of luck and prosperity. All of a sudden, he leaned in closer to the window to find that there were some traces of red paint on a slightly wider wooden sill between two of the windows. The red paint was rather unclear, but he could just barely make out the fact that it was spelling out some text. As the room gradually warmed up, the scholar with the Lu surname was also becoming more courageous. He set down the book in his hand, and upon noticing that his companion was staring at the window, he cast his gaze toward the same direction, only to spot a burst of bright red light beside the window, which illuminated the face of the ghastly old woman, who declared in a raspy voice, "It and oppose. It's already quite late, so you should both go to bed." The sudden emergence of the lantern-bearing old woman almost scared the pair of scholars to death. The old woman had just made her way over from the room directly across from this one, and Chan Ping and oppose, and had also been reading inside and seen the old woman through the window, yet his reaction was nowhere near as panicked and distressed. The old woman shook her head as she hobbled away while chuckling to herself, "Looks like scholars really are cowards." In the other room, Chan Ping and oppose, and was standing near the window, and he said in a quiet voice, "She and oppose s gone." Zhang Shan had regained his consciousness as soon as he entered the estate, and he was instantly reinvigorated upon taking a yang restoration pill washed down with a swig of the wine from Chan Ping and oppose, and oppose s gourd. Originally, he had been unwilling to waste a pill, but he had suddenly felt a flash of demonic qi in the area, and he didn't oppose dare to conserve his pills any longer. After all, his life was more precious than a single light snow coin. Zhang Shan sat up on the bed, dressed in a new and dry Taoist robe as he leaned down beside the brazier, using the fire inside to warm his hands. As he did so, he said in a quiet voice, "Let and oppose take turns on lookout duty tonight, Chan Ping and oppose, and otherwise I want and oppose be able to rest at all. I can and oppose shake the feeling that something and oppose not right about this place." Chan Ping and oppose and smiled as he replied, "All you need to do is hang your peachwood sword and demon detecting bell by the window. I and oppose am not familiar with things like demons and spirits, so I and oppose I'll need the bell to alert me if any of those things are nearby. As for keeping lookout at night, that and oppose something that I and oppose am very good at, so just rest assured and sleep. I and oppose I'll make sure to wake you up if something happens." Zhang Shan thought about this for a moment, then made up another excuse not to immediately go to bed. "All right, I and oppose I'll hang my peachwood sword and demon detecting bell by the window, but I and oppose I'll warm up by the fire a bit longer before I go to bed." While Zhang Shan was hanging up his wooden sword, Chan Ping and oppose and said, "Someone previously inscribed runes onto the windowsill, but it must and oppose they've already been quite a long time, and the runes aren't and oppose very clear anymore. However, they should be Taoist runes. Do you recognize them?" Zhang Shan initially hadn't and oppose noticed these runes, but after hearing what Chan Ping and oppose and had to say, he carefully inspected the windowsill, and only then did he notice some traces of the runes. He couldn't and oppose help but be impressed with Chan Ping and oppose and oppose attention to detail, and as he carefully inspected the runes, a grim look slowly appeared on his face. After that, he gently wiped a finger over the indistinct runes before sniffing at his own fingertip, following which he sat back down in silence. "If things really are as I imagine, then we and oppose in a bit of trouble. The runes inscribed on the windowsill are meant to ward off ghosts, and judging from those remnants, They appear to be a type of divine runes from Divine Edict sect. The runes are extremely powerful, indicating that they were inscribed by a figure of high seniority from Divine Edict sect, and they cover virtually the entire window. On top of that, the strokes are very urgent, so that senior had to have been facing some extremely formidable ghostly entities. Xianxia heaved a forlorn sigh here, then continued in a remorseful voice, "If I had known this would happen, I shouldn't oppose. V taken that yang restoration pill earlier. If I had done that, I wouldn't oppose. V been conscious as we were approaching this estate. I have a decent level of proficiency in skill geomancy and feng shui, and even from afar I wouldn't oppose. V been able to get a rough idea of the characteristics of this property, including whether the feng shui accumulated here is of the yin or yang attribute and whether it in oppose deviated from the path of righteousness. With that information I would be able to extrapolate many things. I and oppose, am sorry Chan Ping and oppose, and my stinginess has put you in a very perilous situation." Instead of consoling the remorseful young Taoist priest, Chan Ping and oppose, and jibed ISN and oppose, "T eliminating fiends and defending Taoism your forte, esteemed Heavenly Master Zhang?" Zhang hurriedly waved his hands as he said, "Please don and oppose. T refer to me as Heavenly Master." A hint of longing appeared in his eyes as he continued in a quiet voice, "True Heavenly Masters are all direct disciples of the Li clan from Mount Longhu and Oppos, Heavenly Master residents. All of them are esteemed figures dressed in yellow and purple, and aside from that, Heavenly Masters of the middle 5 tiers from outside the Zhang clan are also awarded the official title of Heavenly Master. Even among Mount Longhu and Oppos, Heavenly Masters there are many distinctions. The first-rate Heavenly Masters are all upper 5 tiers immortals who are revered and worshipped in the ancestral hall of Mount Longhu. Below them are the direct lineal descendants of the Zhang clan, one of whom will hold the Heavenly Master seal and an immortal sword. Below that comes all of the Heavenly Masters from outside of the Zhang clan who are cultivating on Mount Longhu. As a natural blessed land, Mount Longhu is open to the outside world, as long as those chi refiners promise to leave the mountain to slay demons and eliminate fiends once they reach a certain level in their cultivation. When that time comes, Mount Longhu will bestow upon each of them a peachwood sword. This is the allure and generosity of Mount Longhu, and it and Oppos, a place that all Taoist priests from other continents like myself regard with reverence and longing. Chan Ping and Oppos, and listen carefully to what Zhang Shan had to say, gaining a deeper understanding of the concept of Heavenly Masters in the process. The heavy storm continued, and bursts of faint crackling would occasionally ring out from the pair of petite stone lions situated on either side of the entrance of the estate. The old woman was standing on a small stool in the courtyard, hanging her lit lantern on one of the pillars in the corridor. The flame inside the lantern was flickering in the wind, and all of a sudden it was snuffed out entirely. As it turned out, the wick inside had run out. The old woman began coughing as she got back up onto the stool, then removed the lantern before pulling a new flame out of her sleeve, one that was as red as blood. If one were to look closely at the flame, they would notice that it had no wick. The old woman turned around so that her back was facing the courtyard, then plucked a white hair off her own head before piercing it forcefully into the center of the flame, as if she were using it as a wick. After that, she gently breathed into the flame, and it was instantly ignited before being placed into the lantern, which was, in turn, hung up on the pillar once again. The lantern continued to sway in the wind, illuminating its surroundings with its bright red radiance. On a clear night, it wouldn't oppose, been sure to attract moths, and it was unclear what the purpose of lighting a lantern was on a stormy night in such a secluded estate. Zhang Shan didn't and oppose, feel like sleeping, so he began telling Chan Ping and oppose, and some stories about perilous encounters that he had previously had with demons and spirits. Chan Ping and oppose, and was listening to the stories while taking small sips of wine out of his red gourd when he suddenly brought a finger to his lips in a silencing motion. Zhang Shan immediately fell silent and turned his gaze toward the peachwood sword hanging by the window, but the demon-detecting bell remained completely still. Moments later, the sound of door-knocking rang out, and as it turned out, they were being visited by the pair of scholars. Chan Ping and oppose, and made his way over to the door before opening it. The storm outside was still as ferocious as ever, and the wind was so strong that it was blowing the rain sideways, so there wasn't oppose, A single dry spot even in the corridors under the eaves. The scholar with the Chu surname was holding an umbrella in one hand and a wine flagon in the other with a smile on his face, while the scholar with the Lu surname was breathing onto his own hands to keep them warm. He was also smiling as he said, Brother Chu brought a few flagons of fine wine with him on this journey, and there and Appos, still one left. As the saying goes, sharing is caring, so if you don an Appos, mind how about joining us for a drink? But let me make this clear in advance. I have a very high alcohol tolerance, so I want and Appos. Be able to spare much wine for you. I hope you want and Appos, mind. Chun Ping and Appos, and raised the gourd in his hand with a smile as he replied, I and Appos. V brought my own wine, so the three of you can share that flagon. The scholar with the Lu surname stepped into the room as he chuckled. That sounds like a fantastic arrangement to me. The scholar with the Chu surname followed him into the room, then set down his umbrella in the corner. The four of them sat around the brazier for a moment before the scholar with the Lu surname slapped a palm to his own forehead. I forgot to bring cups. He then turned to his companion with a wry smile as he said, I and Appos. Am too scared to go back for them, Brother Chu. The scholar with the Chu surname stood up with a slightly exasperated smile as he said, If there really are ghosts and spirits in the world, then there would be no need to fear death, would there? If you think about it that way, then it and Appos is a good thing. Besides, scholars like us walk the path of righteousness, so even if ghosts and spirits did exist, they would fear and respect us, so what do you have to fear? With so many people in the room, the scholar with the Lu surname was clearly emboldened, and he was even in the mood to be making jokes. I can and Appos, even secure a decent mark in the imperial examination, so I can barely be referred to as a scholar. In contrast, you and Appos, far more well-read than I am, Brother Chu, so of course you have nothing to fear. The scholar with the Chu surname shook his head before departing, and he quickly made his way over to the room across the courtyard, bringing back 4 wine cups with him shortly thereafter. 2 tall and proud 5-colored roosters were painted onto the inner walls of the cups, and Zhang Shan accepted one of the cups before asking Brother Chu, Brother Lu, could these be the cockfighting cups unique to Colorful Garment Nation? The eyes of the scholar with the Lu surname immediately lit up. You and Appos, heard of our Colorful Garment Nation and Appos, cockfighting cups? The lamp on the table was and Appos, very bright, so Zhang Shan held his cup between 2 of his fingers as he tilted it toward the brazier, using the light of the flame to carefully observe the pair of 5-colored roosters as he mused. These cups are extremely renowned, so of course I and Appos, heard of them. I come from complete Reed continent in the north, and during my travels, I once saw a pair of martial artists gamble exorbitant amounts of wealth using these cups. It and Appos, a very remarkable thing. I hear that all you have to do is fill the cup most of the way with wine, then inject a wisp of spiritual energy into the wall of the cup, and the 2 roosters would begin fighting to the death on their own. Apparently, even 10th tier sages are unable to predict the outcomes of the cockfights in advance. Hence, any cockfighting cups that make it out of Eastern Treasured Vial continent instantly have their prices spike up by hundreds, sometimes even thousands of times. The cockfighting cups of complete Reed continent are one of the important items required to board the Kuan ship at the ferry station in Southern Stream Nation. A proud look appeared on the face of the scholar with the Lu surname, and he smiled as he nodded in response. I don and Appos. Know anything about spiritual energy? But what I do know is that the chi refiners of our Colorful Garment Nation like to use these cups for entertainment purposes. After pouring some wine into the cups, all they have to do is squeeze the cups between their fingers for a moment, and the roosters inside would immediately spring to life before fighting to the death. As for why these cups are considered to be so precious, I once read from some historical chronicles that the 5-color soil used to fire these cockfighting cups is a unique type of soil that and Appos will quickly lose all of its unique properties upon leaving Colorful Garment Nation, and that and Appos how cockfighting cups became unique to our nation. Zhang Shan nodded in response with a contemplative expression, thinking to himself that if anyone could establish a monopoly over this 5-color soil, then they would surely be able to reel in massive profits. Chun Ping and Appos, and was quite willing to believe this claim. Due to his past pottery firing experience, he was very familiar with the properties of soil. The kiln workers of the Dragon Spring Prefecture had worked in pottery firing for generations, and that required them to develop a thorough understanding of soil. As a result, Chongping and Appos, and had heard many fantastic and wacky stories about soil from them. For example, Old Man Yao had once told him that all clay had its own fate, just like humans. Some was molded into bodhisattvas to be worshipped and revered, some was made into fine porcelain to be used by imperial clans, and some was made into crude pots and jars used in the households of common folk. After having some wine, the scholar with the Lu surname had become slightly inebriated, with a hint of redness creeping onto his cheeks. His mood had improved significantly, and he smiled as he said to Zhang Shan, "I can tell from the peach-wood sword on your back that you and Appos, Cultivator. Would you be able to make these roosters in these cups spring to life? If so, we could make some bets and have some fun. What should we bet on?" It was clear that the scholar was a completely different person under the influence of alcohol, and he appeared to have also been a gambler at heart. The scholar with the Chu surname sighed as he dissuaded, "You and Appos, I've already had enough to drink, so you should go to bed, Brother Lu." Zhang Shan also hurriedly replied, "A cockfighting cup is worth a lot of money, so let and Appos not waste one here." The scholar with the Lu surname downed his cup of wine in one go, then hurled the cup viciously into the wall, shattering it into countless pieces as he chortled, "We have to toil away and work ourselves to the bone in order to afford things, yet they continue to outlive us long after we and Appos dead. How absurd is that? How much is a cockfighting cup worth? Only 2 taels of silver in colorful garment nation. But how much is a Jianxia title worth? That and Appos far more expensive. At the very least I can and Appos afford one." An awkward look appeared on the face of the scholar with the Chu surname, and he explained, "Brother Lu always likes to ramble about ridiculous things when he and Appos drunk, so please Don and Appos mind him." Chongping and Appos and merely smiled and continued to drink in silence. In the end, the scholar with the Lu surname was helped back to his room by his companion, with Zhang Shan escorting them to the door. Meanwhile, Chongping and Appos remained seated as he took a glance at the entrance of the room. Under the heavy rain, a burly man with a thick beard and a saber strapped to his waist was wading through the mud, arriving in front of the estate before knocking on the gate. The old woman stood on the other side of the gate as she asked in a raspy voice, "Can I help you?" "I and Appos am here for shelter," the man yelled. "You speak with the demanding arrogance of someone who and Appos not here to seek shelter from the rain," the old woman said in a snide voice. "What? Are you telling me that there in Appos no place for a single man like myself to stay in this entire estate?" The man snapped. "We do have room for you to stay, but my master one and Appos be pleased with someone as arrogant and demanding as yourself," the old woman sneered. "My master is not a very accommodating person, so if you irk him, not only will you be able to stay the night, you may even end up having to stay longer than you bargained for." The individual strands of the man and Appos' beard resembled hard nails, and he gripped onto the hilt of his saber as he glowered at the old woman with a menacing expression. "Cut the chit-chat and let me in. If I stay in this rain any longer, I and Appos am going to fall sick. How am I going to go to the brothels if I get sick? Those little vixens will suck me dry in seconds, then laugh at me for my lack of stamina." The gate slowly swung open as the old woman sighed, "It and Appos much better to be laughed at than to lose your life." The man bristled slightly upon hearing this, then quickly burst into laughter as he replied, "This body of mine has accumulated over 3 decades and Appos worth of young energy, so I and Appos scared of shit. Not only will demons and spirits be too scared to face me, even if their ancestors come out to play, they and Appos will run for their lives when they see me." The man made his way into the courtyard as he spoke, and his brows furrowed slightly as he inspected his surroundings. The old woman slammed the gate shut once again, and all of a sudden a loud crack rang out outside. As it turned out, the head of one of the stone lions outside had fallen onto the ground and shattered into pieces, but the noise was completely drowned out by the sound of the ongoing storm. In the affluent clans of some of the nations in the southern part of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, many women lived in boudoirs, and some of the more strict families would even remove the staircases leading to the upper floor, essentially trapping a woman in a makeshift tower until the day that they were meant to be wed. In one of the sections of the estate was one such boudoir, and despite the fact that it was very late at night, there was a man filling out the eyebrows of a woman, who was laying on a reclining chair. The man was gently working at the woman and Appo's brows with an eyebrow pencil, but the woman and Appo's face was nothing more than a severely mangled mass of decaying flesh, through which many sections of bone were revealed. There were even maggots visibly squirming in her flesh, yet, also visible was her faint smile. Zhang Shan watched as the two scholars returned to the opposite room, then stood in the corridor as he extended a hand forward to catch a small handful of rain. After inspecting the rain for a while, he let it fall onto the ground before returning to the room and closing the door. He then pulled out an ordinary yellow paper talisman with his dry hand as he said, "There really is something not right about this place. The rainwater is particularly heavy and cold, which indicates that it and Appo's very likely to be harboring sinister energies. This talisman of mine is called an evil incinerating talisman. It and Appo's very ordinary, but extremely prevalently used as it can detect the presence of sinister energies." Zhang Shan held the talisman between two of his fingers as he silently recited an incantation, then abruptly stuck it to the remaining moisture in the palm of his other hand, and the talisman instantly ignited upon contact, then quickly burned to ashes. A grim look appeared on Zhang Shan and Appo's face upon seeing this, and he scraped the ashes into the brazier. "How much did that talisman cost?" Chen Ping and Appo's asked. Zhang Shan wasn't Appo's surprised by this question at all, and he replied with a serious expression, "These types of spirit talismans are considered to be illegitimate, much like informal officials in the imperial court. Hence they and Appo's very cheap. All they cost to make is a sheet of yellow paper, and the time and ink required for a chi refiner of the lower 5 tiers to inscribe the talisman. A single snowflake coin can purchase over 30 of these evil incinerating talismans, so it only works out to be around 3 taels of silver per talisman." Chen Ping and Appo's nodded in response. When it came to talismans, he had once witnessed the effects of the barrier-shattering talisman. At the time, everyone had been fooled by the female ghost in the red wedding dress, and they were being led down to the underworld, thereby placing them in a very perilous situation. Thankfully, Lin Shui had been able to guide everyone to safety using a barrier-shattering talisman that fell into the category of mountain and water talismans. After that, in the bamboo building on Downtrodden Mountain, Li Shixing had made some inscription talismans on the walls of the building. This was only something that could be accomplished by a cultivator of a lofty cultivation base and advanced talismanic mastery. In the end, he had bestowed upon Chen Ping and Appo's an elementary book about Taoist talismans, as well as a large stack of talisman papers of different materials. Of course, there was also that wind and snow, all that would allow Chen Ping and Appo's to draw talismans even without the need for red ink. After carefully reading through the authentic death-avoiding book several times, he was able to learn 5 or 6 of the simplest talismans recorded in the book. According to the book, talismans were split up into 9 grades, with chi refiners of the upper 5 tiers inscribing talismans for the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grades, otherwise known as the upper 3 grades. Cultivators of the middle 5 tiers inscribed talismans of the 4th, 5th, and 6th grades, also known as the middle 3 grades, and cultivators of the lower 5 tiers inscribed 7th, 8th, and 9th grade talismans, or talismans of the lower 3 grades. Chen Ping and Appo's, and Wasn and Appo's, a chi refiner, but he was able to use his 18 stops chi channeling technique to inscribe some of the elementary talismans recorded in the authentic death-avoiding book. As for talismans above that level, they were out of Chen Ping and Appo's, and Appo's reach for the moment. Li Shixing had once told him that inscribing talismans was much like sword practice. As the saying went, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach him how to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Instead of teaching Chen Ping and Appo's and how to inscribe certain talismans, he had given Chen Ping and Appo's and this book so that he could learn for himself. However, during his southbound journey, Chen Ping and Appo's had still prioritized his fist technique practice above all else, and as a result, he was only able to inscribe 3 types of talismans during his free time: the land-shortening talisman, the yang energy illumination talisman, and the treasure pagoda demon-suppressing talisman. He had inscribed 2 or 3 of each type of talisman in the event of unforeseen mishaps. The land-shortening talisman could drastically shorten the land, allowing Chen Ping and Appo's to reach any spot within a radius of 100 feet in just a single step. The Yang Energy Illumination Talisman was a type of barrier-shattering talisman, and if he were to encounter another ghost hitting the wall situation in the ruins of ancient battlefields, unmarked burial grounds or other similar places, he would be able to follow the Yang Energy Illumination Talisman to safety. As for the Treasure Pagoda Demon-Suppressing Talisman, this was a more offensive type of talisman that could summon a treasured pagoda to temporarily trap an evil entity, and the pagoda would also lash the soul of said evil entity with the power of lightning. All three of these talismans were among the most ordinary ones recorded in the authentic death-avoiding book, and they were only included in the book at all as they were referenced as classic examples of certain talismanic branches. Zhang Shan and Appo's alcohol tolerance was rather lackluster, and he was feeling rather drowsy after having some wine to drink. Having been pelted by the heavy storm earlier, he was already quite exhausted, and he was reassured by the thought of having Chanping and Appo's and on lookout duty through the night, so he quickly fell asleep. Chanping and Appo's and was very familiar with nightly lookout duty, and he sat on his own while taking small sips of wine. All of a sudden, he abruptly turned toward the corner of the room, where the oil paper umbrella was propped up against the wall. Initially, the umbrella had been carried by the scholar with the Liu surname, but after entering the estate, it had been carried instead by the scholar with the Chu surname. At this moment, the umbrella was propped up against the wall with its tip on the ground and its handle facing upward, but there wasn't any water on the ground beneath it, and that was clearly not normal. Furthermore, Chanping and Appo's and could sense a cold aura in the air that sent chills running down his spine. Hence, he rose to his feet, pretending to stumble a little as if he were drunk, and as he walked across the room, he grumbled to himself under his breath, which one of those geniuses put the umbrella here upside down? If I did something back home, my elders would, and Appo's made sure that I copped an earful. After making his way over to the corner of the room, Chanping and Appo's and pretended to hiccup as he reached out to grab the handle of the umbrella, as if he intended to tip it the right side up, but right as he reached out, a talisman slipped out of his sleeve, and a sharp and piercing look appeared in his eyes as he did away with his drunken facade. He reached out like lightning to catch the yellow paper talisman between two of his fingers, and it was none other than a Treasure Pagoda Demon-Suppressing Talisman. He then slapped the talisman against the handle of the umbrella, and a Treasured Pagoda projection emerged to encompass the entire umbrella, which immediately began to warp while giving off a sizzling sound akin to that of water being thrown over a hot pan. The light radiating from the Treasured Pagoda quickly dimmed, following which the pagoda itself faded away. Chanping and Appo's and was worried that the talismans he had inscribed were too mediocre in quality, so to ensure that whatever sinister force was inside the umbrella was successfully eradicated, he pulled out the other two Treasure Pagoda Demon-Suppressing Talismans that he had inscribed and quickly stuck them to the oil paper umbrella as well. Immediately thereafter, his formidable fist intent erupted out of his body, and he unleashed a relentless barrage of 1-inch punches upon the three demon-suppressing talismans, with every single one of his punches packing formidable explosive power. His fist aura wasn't Appo's damaging the umbrella at all, but his powerful fist intent had all seeped into the umbrella. This was the disparity between an ordinary third-tier martial artist and one that had been taught by Cui Chan and Appo's grandfather. The difference was truly night and day. After doing all of that, Chanping and Appo's and stood in an alert and ready stance while gripping tightly onto his sword nurturing gourd, ready to unleash 1st and 15th at a moment and Appo's notice. However, the umbrella merely shuddered for a short while before a plume of rank black smoke rose up from it, and nothing else happened after the black smoke dissipated. Chanping and Appo's and was a little dumbstruck by how quickly and easily the crisis had been averted. Did this oil paper umbrella really not have anything more to offer? For example, perhaps a fearsome sinister entity was supposed to have erupted out of the black smoke with a thunderous roar. Chanping and Appo's and could still clearly recall the encounter with the female ghost in the red wedding dress on that winding mountain path. On that occasion, it had been completely dominant, and even the blind monk who was skilled in lightning techniques had been no match for her. If it weren't and Appo's for Wei Jin resolving the crisis with a single slash of his sword, Chanping and Appo's and would and Appo's most likely been forced to use up the 2 wisps of sword chi in his body, and that would and Appo's deprived him of the opportunity to engage in that later showdown against Cui Chan at the well. Chanping and Appo's and crouched down as he stared blankly at the oil paper umbrella, and after taking a sip of wine, he reached out to rustle the umbrella a few times, only to be greeted by the sound of falling ashes. He continued to remain in a crouched position, scratching his head while drinking wine with a rather empty feeling in his heart. Having grown accustomed to the hellish training that he had endured every single day in the bamboo building on Downtrodden Mountain, this had been far too easy in comparison. It was like someone who was accustomed to drinking hard liquor being forced to drink water. However, he then began to console himself. Regardless of whether the oil paper umbrella had something to do with one of the scholars, or if that sinister entity had only concealed itself within the umbrella after they had entered the estate, that thing had most definitely only been a lackey that had been sent out to test the water. Hence, he couldn't afford to grow complacent. With that in mind, he rose to his feet, then sat down beside the table and pulled out his wind and snow all from his pocket treasure, using it to inscribe a talisman under the light of the lamp. The talisman was still the same treasure pagoda demon-suppressing talisman, but this time, he was using a sheet of golden talisman paper, rather than yellow paper talisman. After completing a talisman, Chan Ping and Appos, and habitually picked up his wine flagon and took a large swig of wine. He then took a small break to settle his aura, and only after that did he dare to begin inscribing another talisman. In the dark and stormy night, the wind and snow all was flying over the page with flair and gusto in the hands of the slightly inebriated Chan Ping and Appos, and beside him was the sword nurturing gourd and the wooden box that contained subduing demons and eliminating fiends, and of course Zhang Shan was snoring away on the bed. The darkness of the night was only punctuated occasionally by flashes of lightning, and on a small hill not far away from the estate, a middle-aged Taoist priest was holding a fly whisk. There was a dark look on his face, and he spread his hand open to reveal an antiquated copper coin, which suddenly shattered under his gaze. The Taoist priest and Appos' expression darkened even further, and there was a clear pained look in his eyes, but he put on a casual and nonchalant facade as he discarded the coin, then harumphed coldly to himself, "The longer those two filthy creatures keep up their futile resistance, the more punishment they and Appos' be piling on themselves." Standing beside the middle-aged Taoist priest was a tall and imposing man with large eyes and bushy eyebrows. He was severely underdressed in this terrible weather, but didn't Appos' seem to have been bothered at all by the heavy rain. An occasional hint of golden light would flash through his eyes, and there was a fist-sized seal box hanging from his waist. He was beginning to grow a little impatient and disgruntled at the Taoist priest and Appos' failed attempt at making a move, and a cold smile appeared on his face as he said, "If we still have to barge in there by force, then I and Appos' am not going to accept a 50-50 split anymore." The Taoist priest didn't Appos' want to argue over this matter, so he dodged the subject as he asked, "Who is that man who entered the estate earlier, and why did he just so happen to visit on this night?" A mocking sneer appeared on the tall man and Appos' face as he replied, "I heard that a wandering hero came to our colorful garment nation at the end of last year, and he earned quite a reputation for himself by slaying a few mediocre spirits with that saber of his. If my observation is correct, then he and Appos' only a fourth-tier martial artist at the very most. If we were elsewhere, perhaps I would have to be a little wary of him, but we and Appos' on my territory right now, so he and Appos' completely at my mercy. When the time comes, we and Appos' I'll just have to take care of him as well. You can take his body and make it into a puppet or do whatever with it that you please, but I and Appos' am taking that saber." The middle-aged Taoist priest swept his fly whisk through the air, and a cloud of mist rose up from his entire body as his rain-soaked Taoist robes were instantly dried. He then said with a smile, "All right, you have yourself a deal." The tall man hesitated momentarily, then asked, "Are you sure that the backer of the owner of this estate has already fallen from grace in the Divine Edict sect?" The middle-aged Taoist priest nodded in response as he jeered, "Aran and Appos', you supposed to be a mountain god? You seem awfully out of the loop." A dark look appeared on the tall man and Appos' face as he spat through gritted teeth. "It and Appos' all because of that estate. It contained some secret formation from Divine Edict sect that slowly devoured all of the spiritual energy in the area. As a result, my godly body has been gradually eroded during this past century, and no one even regards me as a mountain god anymore. In fact, I and Appos' am not even treated with the same level of respect as mountain lords elsewhere. I one and oppose. Be able to rest at night until I exact vengeance against them. The Taoist priest nodded in response before offering up some words of consolation. The mountain god temple in this area was the place where the man and Apos' godly body was revered, and it was an illegal temple that hadn't and Apos' been officially appointed by colorful garment nation imperial court to begin with. On top of that, the area was riddled with unmarked graves, resulting in a vast abundance of sinister energies. After the tall man became the mountain god, he accelerated the process of the natural environment and Apos' decay for the sake of his own cultivation base. As the eye of the formation, the estate only drew upon sinister energies and left the natural spiritual energy of the area completely untouched, so it was actually serving to maintain balance, but there was no point in discussing such matters. The middle-aged Taoist priest who had deviated onto devilish paths, and the equally deplorable mountain god were both aware that neither of them were saints. I and Apos' am doing this to reclaim my territory while you want to take that female ghost and Apos' body to use as your puppet, so our objectives are clear, but what does that guy want? Could it be that there in Apos' some secret precious treasure in this estate that we don and Apos' know about? The tall man suddenly asked. I and Apos' am not sure, the Taoist priest chuckled in response. How about we ask him together? That sounds like a good idea, the tall man replied with a knowing smile. The Taoist priest inspected his surroundings to find a series of bleak and desolate mountains with extremely sparse vegetation, and he knew that what little vegetation was present here only existed thanks to that female ghost. That female ghost and Apos' fate and personality were both very rare, and that was why the Taoist priest had become increasingly more eager to claim her upon arriving here. In the second section of the estate, the light in the room had already been snuffed out, indicating that the two scholars had already gone to bed, yet the lamp in Chanping and Apos' and in Zhongshan and Apos' room was still lit. Before the old woman had a chance to knock on the door, the man who had just arrived in the estate had already caught a whiff of the wine in the room, and he immediately began pounding on the door as he yelled, "Do you have some wine that you can spare? I and Apos' do just about anything for a drink right now." The old woman made no effort to stop him, merely remarking, "Sort out who and Apos' staying in which room by yourselves, Chanping and Apos', and replace the stopper on his wine gourd." Then opened the door to find a man with a rugged appearance standing outside. The man took a glance at Chanping and Apos', and then said in a casual manner, "Are you also a martial artist, kid? I can tell from the way that you walk and breathe. Have you reached the second tier yet?" Chanping and Apos' and smiled as he replied, "I and Apos' we've been studying martial arts from my seniors from a young age, and this is my first time exploring the world on my own, so I still don and Apos' know the distinction between tiers yet." Meanwhile, Zhongshan had already been woken up by the commotion and was sitting on the edge of the bed, putting on his shoes. The man strode into the room before sitting down onto a chair as he mused, "You and Apos' saying you don and Apos' know the distinction between tiers? So you must be from some impoverished rural area, right? In that case, why have you embarked on such a long journey? And why are you so fluent in the official dialect of our eastern treasured vile continent? You can and Apos' learn something like that from any rural area. You must be a spirit wearing human skin, Aran and Apos' you." The man drew his saber most of the way out of its scabbard as he spoke, and the blade of the saber was giving off a bright gleam as he glowered at Chanping and Apos' and roared, "Tell me your name." "My saber doesn't and Apos' slay nameless ghosts." Chanping and Apos' and Zhongshan exchanged a flabbergasted glance with one another. Could it be that the rain was so heavy that water had gushed into the man and Apos' head? Among Qi refiners, there were countless itinerant cultivators pursuing all types of unorthodox paths. Even demons and plants that attained sentience were inevitably discriminated against, but they certainly Waren and Apos' actively hunted. However, ghostly cultivators were an exception to this, and once discovered, it was virtually inevitable that they were going to be hunted down and killed. The cycle of life dictated by the heavenly Tao involved birth, aging, illness, and death. In their pursuit of immortality, Qi refiner were going against the heavenly Tao. Those who perished were considered to be part of the natural order, but ghostly cultivators fell into neither camp, So they were widely denounced as unjust beings that had to be killed. Ghostly cultivators Warren and Apos, cultivators when they were alive, nor were they mountain and river gods that were appointed by imperial courts after their deaths. Hence, the targets that were hunted by the truly formidable heavenly masters of Mount Longhu primarily consisted of ghosts that wreaked havoc throughout the land, as opposed to spirits that were hiding in mortal society. The more lively and prosperous a place was, the more neutral the term spirits was, holding neither negative nor positive connotations. In some larger nations, particularly powerful empires with well-established immortal sects, even the mortals were often accustomed to coexisting with all types of strange and wacky spirits. It was said that there were many petite winged spirits that could fly around and help women wash and comb their hair, apply makeup and fold their clothes. These spirits were extremely close with their owners, and were considered to be a great asset to society. Ping and Apos, and Didin and Apos, bothered to defend himself, merely removing the stopper from his wine gourd before taking a sip of wine. The saber-wielding man faltered slightly upon hearing this, then gulped slightly, clearly craving the wine that Ping and Apos, and was drinking. His aggressive demeanor instantly faded, and he said in a shameless manner, "If you let me drink some of your wine, I can turn a blind eye even if you really are a ghost. As long as I Don and Apos catch you committing any evil deeds, we can get along just fine." Ping and Apos, and shook his head in response. The man heaved a long sigh. "You and Apos, a conniving and dishonest lad that and Apos, what you are. You and Apos, using your wiles to trick good and honest men like me." Xianxia hurriedly sat down to act as mediator, striking up a conversation with the man in the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Inside the boudoir of the estate, the man and the woman were snuggled up next to each other on the reclining chair. The woman was wearing a dark green dress with a massive skirt that concealed her legs and feet. The man gently whispered into the woman and Apos' ear, "May you always have warm clothes to wear during the cold spring. May you always be happy. May you always be greeted by the sight of clear skies and stunning scenery whenever you look out the window." The hideous woman began to make a series of unintelligible sounds in response, almost as if she were sobbing, and the skirt of her dress was rippling like waves. The old woman was walking through the pitch-black corridor, heaving a faint sigh to herself. In the end, she sat down beside the pillar where the lantern had been hung up. Day after day, year after year, the old woman stroked her own withered face, and she had long forgotten how many years it had been since she had last looked in the mirror. She could only presume that the same applied to her young mistress, who hadn't Apos taken a single step out of her boudoir in the past century. The saber-wielding man was in the process of chatting with Xianxia when his hand suddenly flew onto the hilt of his saber, and his joking demeanor instantly vanished as he said in a serious voice, "Just as the rumors in the nearby town say, the demonic chi is coming from the backyard of this estate, and it and Apos' extremely formidable demonic chi. It and Apos' no wonder that the feng shui in this place has completely wasted away. There could well be a 6th-tier demon here. I and Apos am going to slay the demon. If anything goes wrong, make sure to get out of here right away. Don and Apos, brush off my words of warning. This is an extremely perilous place, and you could easily lose your lives here if you and Apos not careful." The man then paused momentarily before continuing, "There and Apos no need to run right away. Otherwise, the demon in this estate could pounce from the shadows. Even if I and Apos am defeated, I and Apos I'll do everything in my power to keep them at bay. When the time comes, listen to my call, and when I tell you to run, Don and Apos hesitate to do so." After that, the man took a deep breath before drawing his saber out of its scabbard. He then reached out a hand to brush aside the ashes in the brazier before pulling out a lump of lit charcoal that he held in his hand, rubbing it against the blade of the saber to send sparks flying in all directions, giving the saber an even sharper and more resplendent appearance. Even though the chances of victory were quite slim, the man wasn't Apos displaying any fear, and he appeared to have a truly heroic heart. The man and Apos' courageous display earned Ping and Apos' respect, and he offered his gourd to the man, only for the latter to turn him down with a smile as he rose to his feet with his saber in his hand. "I always crave a drink when they're in Apos' nothing happening to stave off the boredom. but slaying powerful demons and ghosts is far more exhilarating than drinking. The man pushed the door open and strode into the backyard in the stormy night, and the light radiating from his saber illuminated the surrounding area as he raised his head, casting his gaze into the distance. "My name is Xianxia. Come out to face me." Zhang Shan picked up his peachwood sword and demon detecting bell, then said to Changping and Appos, and in a solemn voice, "I and Appos, LL go help him slay the demon. You and Appos, Re a pure martial artist, so you and Appos, Re not fit to face ghosts and demons in battle before you reach the 4th tier. Hence you should stay here and I and Appos, LL call for you if we need you." Changping and Appos, and nodded in response. With that, Zhang Shan rushed out the room in a lithe and agile fashion, and after remaining in his chair for a moment, Changping and Appos, and chose not to continue waiting in the room. Instead, he also stepped outside, peering through the rain to the room on the other side of the courtyard as he declared, "I know it and Appos. Su." The lamp in that room had already been snuffed out long ago, yet the door slowly swung open, and the scholar with the Chu surname emerged from inside. He was holding the torch that had been snuffed out by the rain earlier, and there was a faint smile on his face. After looking across at Changping and Appos, and for a while he raised a hand, rubbing his palm against the end of the torch, and it was instantly ignited. After that, he gently plunged the other end of the torch into a nearby pillar, and the torch pierced halfway into the pillar with ease. "You and Appos, Re the one who talks the least out, but you and Appos, Re the smartest of the bunch. Of course, you must have some skills to back up your smarts as well, considering you were able to vanquish Taoist White Deer and Appos, Copper Coin Ghost. However, that and Appos, only a 3rd-tier ghost with not much merit to speak of, so Dawn and Appos, take that as a reason to grow arrogant and conceited." Changping and Appos, and remained silent, and all of a sudden, he vanished from the spot without any warning. The scholar faltered slightly upon seeing this. A figure shot through the space between the two rooms like lightning, pouncing directly at him. The scholar was and Appos, taking Changping and Appos, and very seriously, and he didn't and Appos, even have a chance to react before he was struck on the head by a swift and vicious punch that left a trail of glowing white fist aura behind it. He was sent flying through the air, crashing through the wall and the door before tumbling onto the corridor outside. In the end, his back crashed into a thick pillar, causing countless tiny cracks to appear on the pillar, and only then was he stopped in his tracks with blood gushing out of his mouth. His soul was jangling in his body, and there was an astonished look on his face. Not only was the punch extraordinarily powerful, the fusion of fist intent and fist aura was even more remarkable, which had a suppressive effect on him, much like the ghost striking whips used by immortals. A resounding boom rang out as he was struck by another punch to the neck, and this time, even the pillar behind him was toppled. These 2 punches had left tears and blood streaming down all over his face. His robes were in tatters, and he was utterly infuriated, so much so that he was about to revert to his true form and completely do away with the original plan. Right at this moment, he heard Changping and Appos, and utter a single word. First, anyone who had ventured into the world for any substantial period of time had some trump cards up their sleeve. As soon as the scholar with the Chu surname heard Changping and Appos, and utter the word first, he felt a sense of foreboding, and he knew that this was most likely one of Changping and Appos, and Appos' trump cards. However, he couldn't and Appos identify where this sense of peril was coming from. His mind was racing, and he gritted his teeth as a white ball slid out of his sleeve. The ball was glowing brightly even in the darkness of the night, and it was clear that it was no ordinary object. The scholar clutched the ball tightly in his hand, and it melted like wax in the face of fire, turning into a liquid as viscous as mercury. The stream of liquid then quickly spread over his arm and soon covered his entire body. All of a sudden, it was as if he had put on a suit of pristine white armor. The breastplate at the center of the suit of armor was shimmering brightly, and it had been forged to resemble the suits of radiant armor worn by deity statues in the temples and monasteries of the mortal world. If it weren't and Appos, for the fact that the scholar could sense that his life was under threat, he would and Appos, sooner reverted back to his true form than use this priceless armor pellet. Armor pellets were supreme militarian treasures extremely revered and sought after, and there was no ceiling to how expensive they could be. Furthermore, demand had always far outweighed supply for these things, and they were generally jointly forged by Mahist mechanists and cultivators from the talismanic branch of Taoism. In their normal state, armor pellets were fist-sized balls that were very portable and didn't take up much space. Upon being injected with true qi, they instantly transformed into an all-encompassing suit of indestructible armor. The armor protecting the scholar was giving off a layer of faintly rippling white light, illuminating the surrounding rain-covered ground a bright white color, and as he rose to his feet, he appeared far calmer than before as he said with a wry smile, "You and Oppos, you truly screwed me over, kid. I prepared this suit of radiant armor in the potential case of a disagreement when splitting the spoils and both Taoist white deer and that mountain god turned on me, but now that I and Oppos, we've been forced to reveal it, they and Oppos, I'll already know that I have this suit of armor in my possession, so what am I to do now?" Despite the casual tone of his voice, the scholar didn't dare to let down his guard in the slightest. He was rather perplexed about why there had been no follow-up after Chunping and Oppos, and had uttered the word first. No sword had flown out of the opposite room from his wooden box, nor had any allies lurking in the shadows sprang forth to make their presence known. The scholar knew that Chunping and Oppos, and definitely wasn't Oppos, the type of person who liked to make jokes. With just 2 punches, Chunping and Oppos, and had almost forced him to revert back to his true form, and he was confident that even that brash saber-wielding man with his 4th-tier powers wouldn't Oppos have been able to achieve the same feat. Hence, even though this first was yet to make an appearance, the scholar knew that as soon as it appeared, it would definitely be a formidable opponent, or a powerful treasure, either of which would be sure to pose a serious threat to him. Meanwhile, a slightly frustrated look appeared on Chunping and Oppos' face as he gave the sword nurturing gourd hanging from his waist a firm slap. Inside the sword nurturing gourd, first had inexplicably undergone a drastic change in personality. Prior to this, it had been very violent and short-tempered, often administering physical punishment upon Chunping and Oppos, and for no reason. However, upon leaving Downtrodden Mountain, it had become extremely lazy, laying around and doing nothing all day, and it couldn't Oppos even be bothered to punish Chunping and Oppos, and anymore. Even after that firm slap of the sword nurturing gourd, first remained completely unmoved, hovering in a stationary manner in the space within the sword nurturing gourd. In contrast, 15th was buzzing around incessantly, voluntarily engaging in communication with Chunping and Oppos, and to the best of its abilities as if it were telling him that if first didn't Oppos want to heed his call, then it would be happy to fight in first and Oppos' stead. After attaining sentience, the pair of flying swords resembled infants that were still not yet able to speak. They possessed intelligence but not to a very high degree, and they still acted mostly according to their instincts. They could clearly sense Chunping and Oppos' intentions and emotions, but communication was often quite difficult between them. Furthermore, Chunping and Oppos only had a vague sense of what they were feeling at any given point in time, which further impeded their communication. Upon spotting Chunping and Oppos' gesture, the scholar immediately turned his gaze toward the red wine gourd that was hanging from Chunping and Oppos' waist. However, he discovered Chunping and Oppos and gave him a very straightforward answer. "If I don't and Oppos beat you, my friend, and that man with the saber will be in a lot of danger." A cold look appeared in the scholar and Oppos' eyes. He was a 5th-tier cultivator who was used to being respected and revered, even by the imperial clan of ancient Elm Nation, so he was naturally no pushover. "It sounds like you and Oppos not going to repent until you and Oppos met an early grave. Let me tell you this. There are still 2 other people just as formidable as myself waiting to pounce outside the estate. Are you sure you want to get involved in this? Do you really think I and Oppos am scared of you?" Chunping and Oppos' response instantly had the scholar fuming. "Whether you and Oppos scared of me or not has nothing to do with whether I and Oppos am going to fight you." Chunping and Oppos took a deep breath, and he had wasted this much time talking to the scholar, not because he was trying to show off or anything like that. Instead, he was taking this time to gauge the attitudes of the 2 flying swords in his sword-nurturing gourd. That was a key factor that determined how he was going to approach this fight. Back when it first appeared in Changping and Appo's, and Appo's house on Clayvase Alley, first had emerged in the form of a tiny streak of white light suspended in mid-air. Even though its blade was very slender, it was filled with a vast aura of righteousness, and it had displayed itself in its full power and glory without making any attempt at concealment. In contrast, 15th, which Changping and Appo's, and had obtained from Old Man Yang, was less direct and confrontational. It had a more peaceful disposition, and whenever it moved around inside the sword-nurturing gourd, it would always do so in a jerky manner, moving extremely quickly with abrupt stops and starts. Furthermore, whenever it drew close to the inner wall of the sword-nurturing gourd, it would always come to an abrupt halt just short of striking the wall, in stark contrast with first, which would always fly around wildly inside the gourd, crashing into its walls with reckless abandon. Hence, Changping and Appo's, and had determined that little capital, or as Changping and Appo's, and had renamed it first, was sharper than 15th and also more sturdy. Its flaws, however, were also very clear, namely its lackluster speed and how difficult it was for Changping and Appo's, and to control. Hence, whenever Changping and Appo's, and used it, he would always find it to be lacking in precision and accuracy in battles where Changping and Appo's, and was locked in an impasse with his opponent or held a slight advantage. He could summon first and allow it to whiz through the air in its full chaotic glory, wreaking havoc as it pleased, and its sturdiness meant that Changping and Appo's, and didn't and Appo's, have to worry about it being chipped or damaged. However, during perilous battles where precision was of the utmost importance, the more obedient and faster 15th was required to deal the lethal killing blows. Bonded flying swords were naturally very formidable, and they were extremely sought after for all swordsmen under the heavens. Any swordsman that was lucky enough to obtain a bonded flying sword would cherish it as much as their own life, and they were a huge pain to deal with for all chi refiners of the other 100 schools of thought. However, there were two problems surrounding all bonded flying swords, the first of which was that they were difficult to obtain, with an enormous amount of precious resources required to forge them, and the second problem was their cost of repair. While it was true that bonded flying swords were renowned for their power, if they were damaged in battle even in the slightest, such a small chip or crack appearing on the blade, then their repair would incur enormous cost. This was why it was often said that the fortunes of swordsmen could swing drastically at the drop of a hat. A swordsman could easily be in possession of enormous wealth one day, only to be completely stripped of that wealth the very next day. Changping and Appo's, and had initially called upon first instead of 15th precisely because the former was sturdier and less likely to be damaged, and he was also worried that 15th would end the battle with a single blow, thereby depriving him of the opportunity to test out the power of his fists. It was clear that no peaceful resolution was going to be reached here, so the only course of action was to fight. The scholar with the Chu surname pointed at Changping and Appo's, and then tapped the shimmering breastplate as he said, "You seem to take great pride in your fists, so why Don and Appo's? Do you have a go at this spot here? This armor pellet is worth 3,000 snowflake coins, and it comes straight from the imperial vault of ancient Elm Nation. If you can break it, then you are certainly worthy of taking pride in your fists." Changping and Appo's, and required no further invitation. He immediately pounced forward like a speeding arrow, launching himself forward with such tremendous force that the bricks beneath his feet instantly shattered. In the natural world, trees had always been known to be immobile, incapable of moving from the place where they had taken root. As a tree spirit, the scholar with the Chu surname was a 5th-tier chi refiner with a formidable physical constitution, but he had also inherited the slow and cumbersome nature of trees, which meant that speed of movement and close-quarters combat were both weaknesses of his. That was why he had spent such a massive price to purchase this armor pellet, to serve as a life-saving trump card in times of peril. He possessed a naturally sturdy and resilient body, and now that he was clad in his suit of armor, he was confident that he would be able to withstand Changping and Appo's, and Appo's, punches. Changping and Appo's, and Appo's, first punch packed such tremendous power that the breastplate of the scholar and Appo's, suit of armor caved in by over an inch, while the scholar himself was sent flying through the air, crashing into the outermost wall of the estate and Appo's, courtyard. However, the blow seemed to have done nothing more than knock him back, and the wall behind him shattered violently, revealing a harrowing sight to behold. As it turned out, the interior of the wall didn't and Appo's, T consist of layers of bricks. Instead, it was a tangled mass of tree roots that were slowly squirming and moving. The scholar dusted off his shoulders, then sneered, "Is that all you and Oppos forgot? Without a 6th-tier hero and Oppos Gall pill, even if I stand completely still here and allow you to punch me as many times as you want, it and Oppos, it'll still be very difficult for you to break through my armor, young Master Chan." Martial artists of the 4th, 5th, and 6th tiers no longer focus solely on bodily refinement. Instead, their martial arts training would be elevated to encompass chi refinement as well. As a result, martial artists of this level were known as lesser grandmasters, and each tier also had its own corresponding subject, namely the souls, the spirit, and the gall. Upon fully mastering those 3 subjects, the martial artist and Oppos' combat prowess would be elevated significantly, and not only would that reciprocate their physical bodies, it also made them better equipped to deal with chi refiners, as well as spirits and ghosts. With every single one of their attacks, their fist aura would be as scorching hot as the sun, allowing them to incinerate sinister forces. Chun Ping and Oppos had struck the first blow exactly where he had aimed it, yet he didn't and Oppos press his advantage. It was not because he had run out of strength after just a single punch. Instead, this was really only an appetizer for what was to come, and Chun Ping and Oppos pursued the scholar as he had been startled by the strange tree roots exposed by the shattered wall behind the scholar. Could it be that these tree roots ran throughout all of the walls in this entire estate? In the backyard, erratic flashes of light that illuminated the night, and the loud roars of Su Yuanxia could also be occasionally heard. Chun Ping and Oppos had already used up his 3 yellow paper treasure pagoda demon-suppressing talismans, but he still had the 2 golden demon-suppressing talismans concealed up his sleeve, as well as 2 land-shortening talismans. Prior to this, Chun Ping and Oppos' punches had all been quite direct and relied solely on his baseline physical strength. However, Chun Ping and Oppos decided that this was going to change. He adopted a very strange stance, taking a step forward before relaxing his arms and slowly clenching his hands into fists, performing the sequence of movements in an extremely smooth and fluid fashion. All of a sudden, Chun Ping and Oppos' fist intent surged forth like turbulent floodwaters, and it was truly blindingly bright. From the perspective of the scholar, it was as if a radiant sun had risen up over the horizon, presenting a stunning sight to behold. Hikuden and Oppos helped but gulped nervously, thinking to himself that perhaps negotiation was an option worth re-exploring after all. Why was it that he didn't and Oppos feel safe even in his suit of armor? This boy clearly still hadn't and Oppos reached the 3 chi tempering tiers of martial arts, so how did he possess such unreasonably tremendous fist intent? For the first time, thoughts of retreat began to creep into the scholar and Oppos' mind. At the very least, he had to be more prudent in his approach instead of continuing to stand still on the spot like a tree stump, allowing Chun Ping and Oppos to rain punches down upon him as he pleased. Right as he was about to move, Chun Ping and Oppos abruptly vanished into thin air, then reappeared directly in front of him in the blink of an eye, drilling a punch into his breastplate. The punch packed tremendous power, causing the scholar to stumble to the side. However, at the same time, he heaved an internal sigh of relief. After adopting that proper fist stance, Chun Ping and Oppos' fist intent had become extremely intimidating, but the power of his punch hadn't and Oppos' increased by much. Back in the bamboo building on Downtrodden Mountain, Chui Chan and Oppos' grandfather had proclaimed that the key to his deity drumming technique was the first punch. As long as the first punch landed, the sequence would be commenced, and all of the subsequent punches would also land. Hence, Chun Ping and Oppos had to ensure that the first punch struck his opponent, and as for how many punches he could unleash after that, that would depend on how many times he could swing his fists before he fell from exhaustion. Hence, in order to ensure that this first punch didn't and Oppos miss its target, Chun Ping and Oppos had even used a land-shortening talisman. After that, Chun Ping and Oppos' punches came faster and faster, but they were only slightly more powerful than before. All of his punches struck the acupoints all over the scholar and Oppos' body, and all the while, light was surging incessantly over the scholar and Oppos' suit of armor. Wherever Chun Ping and Oppos' and Apo's fist struck, that spot on the suit of armor would abruptly light up, and it was truly living up to its reputation as one of the most prized treasures of ancient Elm Nation. Whenever the scholar attempted to evade Chunping and Apo's fists, he always found himself half a step too slow, rendering him unable to dodge the strikes. He was completely powerless to resist, and after copping 10 punches in a row, his face had turned deathly pale. His shoulder, his chest, his ribs, his abdomen, his back, his temple, his glabella, his knee. All of those important points on his body had been struck during Chunping and Apo's relentless barrage. Chunping and Apo's fists were as fast as lightning, and even more concerning was that Chunping and Apo's expression remained as calm as ever, while his breathing also maintained the same even tempo. His heart was so still, and every single movement of his was executed to perfection. He was fighting like an old monster that had lived for centuries. After 15 punches, the skin and flesh on Chunping and Apo's fists had been torn away, revealing some of the bones underneath, but this amount of pain certainly wasn't Apo's enough to slow him down. Compared with having the skin, flesh, and bones of his fingers being pulverized bit by bit, and compared with the agony of having to tear through his own skin and rip out his own tendons, this amount of pain was almost blissful to Chunping and Apo's. And, at this point, the scholar had already revealed half of his true form, swelling up to 10 feet tall. His eyes had turned green, and his face was riddled with bulging veins. Beneath his suit of armor, it could be seen that his muscles were expanding, and they were becoming as rugged and knotted as the bark of an old tree. He crossed his arms to form a barrier in front of his face, and as he was sent flying back over and over again, he yelled with all his might, "Taoist White Deer Mountain God Qin, we have to abandon our original plan. Come and help me. Hurry." Over on the hill outside the estate, the mountain god and Apo's expression changed slightly upon hearing this. The flame burning on the torch that had been plunged into the pillar by the scholar earlier quickly detached itself from the torch, and most of it quickly dissipated, but one small ball of fire remained, slowly drifting down the corridor toward where the battle between Chunping and Apo's and the scholar was taking place. Through the flame, the mountain god was able to observe what was happening inside the estate, so he was able to see the ongoing battle, and that left him in a difficult predicament. He wasn't Apo's hesitating about whether he should help the scholar or not. Instead, he was considering what was the ideal time for him to enter the fray in order to secure the greatest benefit for himself. Prior to that suit of armor being broken, he definitely wasn't Apo's going to get involved. If he swooped in now to help the scholar kill Chunping and Apo's and preserve that suit of armor, that would only be detrimental to his own cause. All of a sudden, the middle-aged Taoist priest beside him suddenly said, "That man and Apo's saber is sharper than I anticipated. If I continue to wait here, that female ghost is going to be harmed. What do you say, Mountain God Qin? Will you accompany me or continue to observe the proceedings from here? We and Apo's allies, so we should advance and retreat together," the mountain god replied with a smile. "I can and Apo's just back down now, can I?" The Taoist priest burst into laughter, then tossed his fly whisk forward, and right before it landed on the ground, it transformed into a physically imposing white deer. The Taoist priest then flew onto the deer and Apo's back, and it rushed forward at a rapid speed, causing the Taoist priest and Apo's wide sleeves to billow in the wind. Thankfully, there were no mortals nearby. Otherwise, they would and Apo's most likely already fallen to their knees and begun kowtowing to what they would and Apo's surely perceived as a deity. Instead of using any mystical abilities, the mountain god merely took a step forward, and he immediately arrived by Taoist white deer and Apo's side. The white deer was rushing as fast as the wind, and it quickly arrived outside the estate. The Taoist priest sprang up into the air, and the white deer instantly reverted back into a fly whisk that fell into his grasp as he yelled, "Brother Chu, I and Apo's come to help you." Meanwhile, Chunping and Apo's had reached his limit after throwing 20 consecutive punches, yet he was still unable to shatter that suit of armor. The scholar and Apo's soul was jangling in his body, and blood was flowing out of all of his orifices. He had also been forced to completely reveal his true form, and the entire corridor had been destroyed during the course of their battle, but the scholar had only lost his ability to fight. Thanks to his sturdy physical constitution and the suit of radiant armor, he was still able to ensure self-preservation so that he wasn't Oppos, killed by Chun Ping and Oppos, and Oppos' fist aura. Daoist white deer came descending down from the heavens, while Chun Ping and Oppos, and withdrew his fist before gently patting his sword-nurturing gourd. A streak of white light instantly flew out of the gourd before striking the breastplate of the suit of armor, which already severely dented. All of the light on the suit of armor instantly converged to the spot that was struck by the streak of white light, and a faint crack akin to the sound of shattered chinaware rang out. The streak of white light was repelled, then vanished in a flash. The scholar was horrified by this turn of events, but the alarm and horror on his face then quickly turned to elation. His armor had managed to withstand the blow, so he was still alive. However, in the next instant, he felt a burst of sharp pain in his glabella, and his hulking body came falling back in a lifeless fashion. On the brink of death, he roared in a furious voice, "How dare you! You'll pay for damaging the foundation of my great Tao." After delivering this threat, his body suddenly transformed into a large chunk of withered wood that quickly decayed into dust. At the same time, the suit of armor also returned to its ball-shaped armor pellet form. Chun Ping and Oppos, Oppos' brows furrowed slightly upon seeing this. As it turned out, after the emergence of First, 15th had also flown out of the gourd at a far greater speed than First. While all of the spiritual energy in the suit of armor had converged to the armor and Oppos' breastplate to keep First at bay, 15th had pounced on the opportunity to pierce through the scholar and Oppos' glabella with ease. Standing atop the wall of the estate, the mountain god exclaimed in a horrified voice, "Those are bonded flying swords." He then turned and took a large stride backward, quickly appearing 10 kilometers away with sweat pouring down his forehead. "Shit, there and Oppos' a sword immortal here." Daoist white deer had only just landed in the courtyard, yet he also sprang back up into the air and immediately fled for his life. While in mid-air, he tossed his fly whisk forward, and it transformed into that white deer once again. It galloped faster than the wind as it carried the Daoist priest away into the distance. Chun Ping and Oppos, and was rather flabbergasted. "I and Oppos, am just a martial artist who and Oppos, only been practicing fist techniques for less than 2 years. How have I become a sword immortal? I and Oppos, am not even a swordsman at all."